otherwise we'll be experiencing echo. Thank you very much for participating in today's event. There are two main reasons behind our initiative.
Non, tu sais pourquoi? Ce n'est pas bon. Faire celui-là, c'est plus sécurisant. C'est juste l'accès d'urine. Tu vas sentir le besoin d'urine. C'est la grande.
So Lisa, I hear you on the.
Maman Sani.
All right, I will start again. Thank you for participating in today's event. There are two main reasons behind our initiative. First, for too long a time, we discussed Syrian chemical file behind closed doors. Russia sees no reasons to. Russia sees no reason to further prevent increasing transparency of this file. We have nothing to hide. On the contrary, we have a lot to present to the public at large. Therefore, on our proposal, the regular Security Council meeting on chemical Syria in September was held in open. The public is too often presented with only one version of events stamped with the authority of investigative mechanisms whose objectivity and professionalism, we are told, cannot ever be challenged. Second, the Syrian chemical file is extremely politicized. And in the meantime, the conclusions of these investigative mechanisms are used as a tool to implicate the Syrian government. At the same time, arguments of those who oppose biased conclusions of the investigative mechanisms are not seen, are ignored, or not taken into account. There is no real professional discussion of this issue. Meanwhile, there are many reputed international experts who have their own informed opinion on accusations leveled at the Syrian government. And today I would like to introduce to you our briefers who have substantive expertise on matters related to Syrian chemical dossier. They are widely known to general public and invest relentless efforts to share their findings with the international community. These experts shed the light of objectivity on controversial findings of the OPCW Technical Secretariat. Today we have with us Ian Henderson, one of the most experienced OPCW inspectors, a former team lead participating in the investigation of the Duma incident by the OPCW fact-finding mission. We also have with us Aaron Mater, an independent journalist, frequent contributor to the Grey Zone and The Nation, whose most recent article, "Did Trump Bomb Syria on False Grounds?" stirred a wide response internationally. We are glad to greet today Professor Theodore Postol, Professor Emeritus of Science, Technology and International Security at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His detailed analysis of the Khan Sheikhun incident that focused on numerous discrepancies in the FFM report was suspended from publication in one of the most prominent scientific magazines on political grounds. One disclaimer before we start. We didn't, and we never do this, we didn't indoctrinate our briefers what to say. We did not orchestrate this meeting. We just want them to share what their views on the matter is. And we would welcome questions from the participants of today's event should these questions arise. So we hope that they will help us, all of us, to look at the Syrian chemical dossier with unbiased optics. And now I would like to give the floor to my colleague, the co-host of this event, the representative of China.
Thank you, Vasily. Thank you, Excellencies, colleagues. We're glad to see all of you at this Arria Formula meeting on the implementation of Council Resolution 2118. We believe this is a very good opportunity for us to hear some independent views and different opinions from outside experts. China, as a state party to the Chemical Weapons Convention, firmly opposes the use of chemical weapons for any purpose by any country, organization, or individual under any circumstance. Stockpiled and abandoned chemical weapons should be destroyed. China supports the OPCW in fulfilling its mandate in accordance with the CWC. All investigations should be conducted in an objective, fair, impartial, and professional manner to reach conclusions that withstand the test of time and truth. With regard to the chemical weapon issue in Syria, we need to re-emphasize the importance of strengthened dialogue and consultations between the OPCW and the Syrian governments. It is appreciated that the two parties maintain regular contact and have held technical consultations recently. We take note that the permanent representative of Syria has sent a number of letters to the President of the Security Council, providing information on possible chemical weapon attacks by terrorist groups. We call on the OPCW to pay close attention to the information and follow it up in its monthly report. As there are still questions and doubts around certain cases, China calls for more in-depth technical discussions in The Hague before any premature actions be taken. We object hasty accusations to alleged use of chemical weapons in the absence of hard evidence. In January, the Russian delegation hosted an Arria Formula meeting, revealing the gaps and the inconsistency in the Duma report. Up to now, there are still many question marks. The establishment, composition, and working method of IIT are controversial as well. Therefore, China voted against the draft decision in the 94th Executive Council, along with some other members, and non-members abstained on that draft decision. The decision is far from widely supported. Many countries believe it is improper to jump to conclusions, and relevant state parties need to continue technical discussions. It is our consistent position that state parties should bridge differences through dialogue and maintain the established practice of taking consensus-based decisions in the OPCW. The OPCW should make every effort to strengthen mutual trust among state parties and carry on the tradition of making decisions based on consensus. Pushing for a vote while there is still significant divergence will only incite confrontation and undermine cooperation. Some countries can claim that raising different views will harm OPCW's authority. Not true. What really harms the authority of the OPCW is neglecting different views. It is also undermining the reputation, functioning, and the long-term development of OPCW. So as the discussion in The Hague is going on, we are surprised to see a Security Council draft resolution on this file. It is even more surprising that certain countries insist on committing consultations in total disregard of Council members' concerns. Such practice is detrimental to the settlement of the chemical weapon issue in Syria, the momentum of the political process, and the unity of the Council. Bearing in mind the above questions, I would like to thank the briefers for their presence, and I look forward to hearing your professional views and alternative perspectives. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished ambassador from China, and I now would like to give the floor to Mr. Ian Henderson.
Good morning, everyone. First, I should do a sound check just to make sure that I am being heard. Okay. I'm here again at the request of some delegations who requested that I provide my personal experiences as an OPCW inspector. I'll briefly clarify my situation, what I can do and can't do. I'm attending in my individual capacity as a scientist and a former OPCW inspection team leader with 12 years of service, and I would like to stress impartial and committed service, which was recognized. I have one request for everyone attending today is to please kindly refrain from any suggestion that my role is part of anyone's disinformation campaign.
Okay, yeah, and do you know what
Going further, I should point out that I was not directly involved in the Latanima FFM, whilst I have studied the FFM reports and the reports of the IIT on Latanima. It would be inappropriate for me to provide opinion on that case in this forum. However, I was directly involved with the Duma FFM investigation and the SSRC inspections in Syria. And I'll answer any questions on those topics as best I can. Now, some of you may recall at the previous Arria formula meeting on the Syria chemical dossier, I provided a written statement that subsequently became publicly available. In addition to that, the summary report on the engineering analysis on the Duma cylinders is publicly available. So on that score, there's really little further that I need to add. So why am I here? I speak for myself, but I know there are other Duma FFM inspectors who hold the similar concerns that I do about the manner in which the investigation was controlled, locked down, and the findings reflected in the final FFM report. We believe that there is more than sufficient information out there today that has demonstrated our point that the findings reflected in the FFM report on Duma may not reflect the actual situation. But I'm not imploring you to believe me, to implore you to believe us. That is not science. All we are saying is that surely there is sufficient information, facts out there today that would justify a transparent technical inquiry. aimed at clarifying what actually happened in Duma on 7 April 2018. And this needs to be done in a way that demonstrates scientific rigor and integrity, because that currently has not been done. However, the lockdown on Duma remains, how can I say, impenetrable. Our hope, therefore, remains that there's someone with the scientific discipline and integrity to recognize that something may have gone amiss with the Duma investigation and report. Perhaps more importantly, we continue to hope that there's someone who's willing and able, someone who has the courage to do something about this. If and when that happens, we are ready to provide the impartial input of scientists and engineers, and to have the facts and the findings assessed on their merits. That's my introductory statement. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Ian Henderson, and now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Aaron Mate.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Aaron Mate. I'm a journalist with the Gray Zone based in the US. It's an honor to speak to you today about what I think is one of the most important and overlooked global stories in recent memory. The OPCW, the world's top chemical weapons watchdog, is facing a serious scandal. Leaks from inside strongly suggest that the OPCW has been severely compromised, and the implications of this are grave. It would mean that in the case of Duma, the OPCW was exploited to accuse the Syrian government of a chemical weapons attack in Duma in April 2018. It would also mean that the OPCW was used to retroactively justify the bombing of Syria by several member states just days after the alleged Duma incident. In short, it appears the OPCW was compromised to justify military strikes. There are also indications that the OPCW has retaliated against two veteran officials, one of them is here today, who were a part of the Duma investigation and challenged the censorship of the Duma evidence. These two OPCW officials are highly regarded scientists with more than 25 years of combined experience at the organization. Yet, instead of being protected and given the chance to air their concerns, these two scientists have seen their reputations impugned by the OPCW leadership. There is substantial evidence to back all of this up, and today I will try to summarize the key details. The OPCW's fact-finding mission, or FFM, deployed to Syria and what is known as Country X to investigate the Duma incident in April 2018. They interviewed scores of witnesses and visited several key sites. They examined gas cylinders found at the scene, took chemical samples, hundreds of photos, and conducted detailed measurements. Upon their return from Syria, the FFM team drafted an extensive and detailed report of their findings. But what the investigators found in Duma is not what the OPCW released to the world. And that is because the investigators who were on the ground in Syria were overruled and had their findings censored. The key facts about this censorship, to my knowledge, are undisputed. First, the investigators' initial report, which was due for imminent publication, was secretively re-edited to produce a version that sharply deviated from the original. Both versions, the original and the altered report, have been published by WikiLeaks. Comparing both reports, we see the key facts were removed or misrepresented. Conclusions were also rewritten to support the allegation that a chlorine gas attack had occurred in Duma. Yet the team's initial original report did not conclude that a chemical attack occurred. In fact, their report had presented the possibility that victims in Duma were killed in an incident that was, quote, non-chemical related, unquote. Though unstated, the reader could easily infer from this that the militants who controlled Duma at the time had staged the scene to make it falsely appear that a chemical attack had occurred. Then there is the toxicology assessment. 4 experts from an OPCW and NATO member state conducted a toxicology review. They concluded that the observed symptoms of the victims in Duma, quote, were inconsistent with exposure to chlorine, and no other obvious candidate chemical causing the symptoms could be identified, unquote. Yet these statements were kept secret and are inconsistent with the conclusions of the final report. There were also chemical tests of the samples collected in Duma. These samples showed that chlorinated compounds were detected at what amounted to trace quantities in the parts per billion range. Yet this finding was not publicly disclosed. Furthermore, it later emerged that the chemicals themselves did not stand out as unique. Most, if not all, could have resulted from contact with household products such as bleach, or come from chlorinated water or wood preservatives. Crucially, the control samples collected by the inspectors to give context to the analysis results were never analyzed. Because of other leaks, we now know that this censorship was challenged from the inside. The chief author of the initial report, identified by the OPCW as Inspector B, was among those who deployed to Syria for the entire Duma mission. Records show he was also, at the time, the OPCW's top expert in chemical weapons chemistry. On June 22nd, 2018, Inspector B protested the secretive redaction of his report in an email expressing his, quote, gravest concern. I will quote him now. He wrote, "After reading this modified report, which incidentally no other team member who deployed into Duma has had the opportunity to do, I was struck by how much it misrepresents the facts," unquote. After that email of protest, and just days before a substitute stopgap interim report was published on July 6th, something very unusual occurred. A US government delegation arrived at the OPCW and met with members of the team in Duma that had gone to Duma to try to influence them. The US officials encouraged the Duma team to conclude that the Syrian government had committed a chemical attack with chlorine. It is worth noting here that the US delegation promoted this chlorine theory despite the fact that it was still not known at that time that no nerve agents had been found in Duma. The Duma investigators reportedly saw the meeting as unacceptable pressure and a violation of the OPCW's declared principles of independence and impartiality. Under the Chemical Weapons Convention, state parties are explicitly prohibited from seeking to influence the inspectors in the discharge of their responsibilities. Inspector B's intervention thwarted the imminent release of the doctored report. But at that point, the OPCW officials began to manage the issuance of a new negotiated report, namely the so-called interim report that was released on July 6, 2018. Although this interim report no longer contained some of the unsupported claims that senior OPCW officials had tried to insert, the interim report still omitted key facts found in the original uncensored report. Around that time, the investigation saw a drastic change. The protesting Inspector B, who had written the original report, was sidelined from the investigation. OPCW executives then decreed that the probe, from that point forward, would be handled by a so-called core team. This new core team made formal the exclusion of all the inspectors who had conducted the investigation in Syria, except for one paramedic. It was this so-called core team, and not the inspectors who had signed off on the original report, that generated the OPCW's final report of March 2019. This final report sharply differed from what the inspectors reported in the suppressed initial report. The final report concluded that there were reasonable grounds to believe that a chemical weapons attack occurred in Duma, and that, quote, the toxic chemical was likely molecular chlorine, unquote. Many crucial facts and evidence redacted from the original report continued to be excluded. The final report also saw a major discrepancy when it comes to witness testimony. The witnesses interviewed offered sharply contrasting narratives, yet only those witnesses whose testimony supported the use of chemical weapons were used to inform the report's conclusions. It is also worth noting the imbalance in witness locations. Although the alleged chemical incident took place in Syria, twice as many witnesses were interviewed in country X. One inference drawn from the OPCW's final report was that gas cylinders found in Duma likely came from military aircraft. But in a leaked engineering assessment assigned to a sub-team of the FFM, the author of this leaked report found otherwise. The OPCW leadership has yet to offer a substantive explanation for why so much critical evidence was excluded and why the original report was radically altered. The OPCW Director General, Fernando Arias, justified the conclusions of the final report and excused alleged fraudulent scientific behavior by incorrectly stating that the FFM undertook the bulk of its analytical work during the last 7 months of the investigation, or after the interim report of July 2018. But a close review of the final report demonstrates that this claim is far from the case. As the dissenting inspectors have noted, by the time the interim report was released, 31 of the 44 samples were analyzed. 34 of the 39 interviews had been conducted and analyzed, and the toxicological study was already done, but its conclusions excluded. In the nearly 8 months after the interim report was released, only 13 new samples were analyzed, along with 5 additional interviews. Comparing the text of the final report to the original report is also instructive. The final report copy and pastes much of the text of the original report, but the one difference is that inconvenient evidence was removed and unsupported conclusions were added. And even if it were true that the bulk of the analysis was done after the interim report, the fact that the OPCW would have conducted the bulk of its work after July 2018 would not in any way explain or justify the alleged scientific fraud committed before it. In fact, it would only raise the possibility that more fraud occurred. Instead of addressing the discrepancies and cherry-picked facts, the OPCW Director General, Fernando Arias, has denigrated the 2 members of the Duma fact-finding mission who challenged the manipulation of facts and evidence. The Director General has falsely portrayed these 2 as rogue actors with only minor roles in the investigation and incomplete information. Yet these 2 inspectors are unlikely candidates to suddenly go rogue. Inspector A, Ian Henderson, who is here today, while the second inspector is known only as Inspector B. He has not been publicly identified. They served with the OPCW for 12 and 16 years, respectively. Internal OPCW appraisals of their job performance offer effusive praise. In 2005, a senior OPCW official wrote that Henderson has consistently received, quote, the highest rating possible. I consider him one of the best of our inspection team leaders, unquote. In 2018, an OPCW superior wrote that Inspector B, quote, has contributed the most to the knowledge and understanding of chemical weapons chemistry applied to inspections, unquote. Another manager described B as, quote, one of the most well-regarded team leaders whose experience of the organization, its verification regime, and judgment are unmatched. It is important to stress here that the internal concerns go beyond the Duma team members. Earlier this year, I heard from an OPCW official who voiced outrage at the treatment of Ian Henderson and Inspector B. I quote this person now. It is quite unbelievable that valid scientific concerns are being brazenly ignored in favor of a predetermined narrative. The lack of transparency in an investigative process with such enormous ramifications is frightful. The allegations of the 2 gentlemen urgently need to be thoroughly investigated and the functionality of the organization restored, unquote. Now, fortunately, the 2 inspectors involved in this Duma controversy have offered a path to transparency into resolving this scandal. Earlier this year, they each wrote letters to the OPCW Director General asking for their concerns to be heard. The inspectors have received support from several prominent figures, including the OPCW's first Director General, Jose Bustani. In October 2019, Bustani took part in a panel that heard a detailed presentation from one of the Duma investigators. Mr. Bustani wrote, quote, "The convincing evidence of irregular behavior in the OPCW investigation of the alleged Duma chemical attack confirms doubts and suspicions I already had. I have always expected the OPCW to be a true paradigm of multilateralism. My hope is that the concerns expressed publicly by the panel in its joint consensus statement will catalyze a process by which the organization can be resurrected to become the independent and non-discriminatory body it used to be." I hope that Mr. Bustani's words will be heeded. As a first step, the OPCW can simply do what it has not done so far. Meet with the entire Duma team and let them present the evidence that was censored. It is very concerning that despite these serious allegations here, the OPCW Director General has never met with members of the Duma team, not just the 2 dissenting inspectors that are publicly known, but the entire team. If the OPCW is confident in its conclusions, it should have no issue with at least hearing a dissenting point of view from its own inspectors. The importance of addressing this issue extends far beyond repairing the OPCW's reputation. Syria is a country that is now trying to rebuild from a devastating, nearly decade-long proxy war that caused massive suffering, destruction, and death. But as Syria is trying to rebuild, it now faces a new kind of warfare in the form of crippling economic sanctions. In justifying the sanctions, the US government has cited, among other things, allegations of chemical weapons used by the Syrian government. The US government also says the Syrian government is the target of these sanctions, but it is the Syrian people who are feeling the pain. The UN rapporteur on sanctions says that, quote, "Unilateral sanctions applied to Syria have visited untold sufferings on ordinary people." The World Food Program warns that Syrians living under economic blockade now face, quote, "mass starvation or another mass exodus." The use of the OPCW to justify warfare on Syria, whether in the form of military strikes in 2018 or economic strangulation today in 2020, is additionally tragic in light of the OPCW's own history. It was just 7 years ago that the OPCW was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for its work eliminating chemical weapons, including in Syria. That was a towering achievement and a hopeful moment for those who seek a world at peace. How unfortunate then, the top chemical weapons watchdog now potentially being compromised to lodge unproven allegations against Syria and justify warfare against it. The inspectors who have been silenced and maligned are trying to defend their organization's noble legacy from political exploitation. It is my hope that they will be heard. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Mate for his presentation, and I now would like to give the floor to Professor Theodore Postol. Professor.
I would like to use a share screen so that I can show some slides, please. Can you see that? Can you see the slides? Okay. Okay, my talk today will basically focus on, my remarks will basically focus on a purely technical set of issues. I should note that I've also done quite a bit of analysis on the Duma report and could provide a talk of a similar nature on the Duma situation from what I found there. The particular report I'm talking about today is the Technical Secretariat report on the Khan Sheikhoun alleged nerve agent attack, which supposedly occurred on April 4, 2017. All of the major findings of that report are basically disproved by the evidence cited in that report, and I'll show you some of this. Incidentally, this briefing has many more slides than I'll show, and anybody who wants a copy, please let me know. First of all, there are several distinctly different methodologies that the OPCW analysts use, all of which lead to a conclusion that there are 3 distinctly different wind directions that occurred at the time of the alleged nerve agent attack. There can only be one wind direction to explain a nerve agent attack. There were satellite images of 3 alleged bomb locations found by the OPCW, at least they claimed to have found it. They didn't produce those satellite images, but I'll show you the satellite images, and there's no indication of any bomb damage at all. So these are dramatic, just dramatic examples of disparities between what is claimed and what is actually in the evidence that is claimed. The OPCW laboratory evidence of sarin poisoning of a goat is bogus. I can show you that. I have photographs of the dead goat at the alleged sarin release point that show that the goat was drag marks behind the goat. So this animal was poisoned somewhere else, probably with sarin, and then dragged to the location. So anybody who looks at this would certainly wonder about the accuracy of the allegation. There's a crater at the alleged sarin release point that was not produced by the kinetic impact of a sarin bomb, as was claimed by the OPCW. The expert analysis there is literally non-expert. I hate to say it, it's silly. In fact, the crater was produced by an artillery rocket exploding, and because it was an artillery rocket exploding, there was no sarin to be released at that point. Let me just show you a few things just to give you a sense of orientation. These images are taken directly from the OPCW report. So you'll find this somewhat interesting. Here is the sarin release point that was alleged for the report, in the report. And I've just sort of shown it a little bit more clearly here. Then we have the explosion points. There were 3 air points that were supposedly bombed with explosive bombs. And so this is the sarin plume that, again, this is from the OPCW report. And the natural outcome of that plume is that the plume direction has to be associated with the wind. The wind drives the plume in a certain direction. Now, let me underscore that this wind direction is derived from interviews and received evidence. So it's a rather interesting finding. If we look at the weather reported on the day of the attack, at the time of the attack, we see that the wind direction is 90 degrees relative to the direction of the wind direction derived from interviews and received evidence. One would hope that this would have been checked by the analysts when they put together this analysis. As I'll show you next, there's a third wind direction, which has to be the case if the bombs fell where they claimed. But of course, when you look at the bomb locations, you can see no evidence of bomb damage. Let me explain that next. Basically, the area, here's the area where the alleged sarin release occurred. And basically what happened is there was a camera north of the city looking into the city. And it took advantage of an archaeological mound to get reference points. And using that material, the physical location of the archaeological mound, it developed plumb lines in the direction of the debris clouds. Here's one debris cloud, here's another debris cloud. I flipped this thing over. And then the claim is that they searched along these plumb lines to find physical damage from bombing. So let's see what the physical damage from bombing. Of course, they provided no satellite imagery, although they claim to have provided the satellite imagery. And in fact, I have the satellite image here. So let me take a look at site 2, bomb site 2. So let me just go back here. Bomb site 2 is this site here. Notice it's misaligned. It's misaligned with what they claim. That's another problem, but not as bad as the problem you'll see. You should try to find the bomb damage. This is a before February 21, 2017. This is April 6, 2017. So this is only 2 days after the alleged attack. And this is 50 meters to give you a sense of scale. And supposedly this is a before and after image from a satellite. Now, here's where they claim the bomb damage occurred. I won't go into it here, but I can in great detail. I want to underscore. I can show in great detail where the damage area should be from a 500-pound bomb. This area should be just rubble. There would be no problem seeing this rubble from this satellite photograph. None at all. Okay, let's look at the second bomb site. This is the bomb site that's most distant. I call it bomb site 3. Here again is the before and after satellite images. So I could leave you a long time. Nobody I know has been able to find the bomb damage because there is none. But here's where they claim the bomb fell. 500-pound bomb. Now, if this was a 500-pound bomb on this building landing at this point, the building would be gone. It would be a pile of rubble, very easily seen from a satellite photograph. Plus, you'd probably see quite a bit of damage to the front of this building across the street. So that doesn't seem to show any damage. Then we have this bomb site 1, which is especially interesting because you can see this large, this wide stem. That's an indication that several bombs were dropped in a pattern. One bomb would leave just a narrow stem. So there's probably 2 or 3 bombs, probably in the 500-pound range, that were dropped. Here again is the before and after satellite photograph. And here's where the claim is that these 3 bombs were dropped, or I'll say 2 in this case. And here's essentially this whole block would have been leveled. So there's no question you would be able to see that from the satellite photograph. So the evidence cited on the bomb damage by the OPCW itself shows no bomb damage. So that's an interesting issue. Now for the poison goat. Here we have several images from videos. Incidentally, the OPCW claimed that it extensively looked at videos. 255 videos, they actually say. I don't understand what they were looking at because if you look at the videos, you see all kinds of indications of fraud. Here is a front-end view of the animal. This goat probably was poisoned with sarin. He has classic sarin. There are other things that could give you these symptoms, but we know that sarin was found on the goat's hair, which was collected by an individual whose allegiances were unknown, since there was no chain of custody enforced here. Notice that when you look behind this carcass, you can see tracks. You can also see a rope on the neck of the carcass. So probably what happened is the carcass was put in a small room, small amount of sarin was put in the room, the animal was poisoned, taken on a flatbed truck, and dragged into this area. There's a lot of video I could show you that indicates that this is likely the outcome, likely what occurred. So for example, you have this report saying the goat hair showed evidence of sarin byproducts. That's true, no question about it. But there was no chain of evidence, no chain of custody. And we can clearly see that anyone who's looking at this would, at a minimum, have serious questions about the veracity of the evidence that it had not been planted. I won't talk about birds here for a little while because I want to stick in the time limit. So let's look at these photographs of the, that again, these were published by the OPCW. This is the OPCW image. Well, it's very interesting. These images were chosen so that they were at a time before the attack occurred. So if you look up in this area here, this is an image taken after the attack. If you look up in this area here, here's where the supposed sarin release occurred. And notice you can see evidence of craters. This was a rocket attack. There are 1, 2, 3 areas where there are craters, plus the crater, the rocket crater, explosively formed rocket crater that was alleged to be from a falling bomb. Here's an example of a close-up of this. This is the actual crater. I'll show you shortly how we know the direction. We know the direction from which this artillery barrage came. I'll explain why. In fact, because a UN manual describes how you find this. And so that basically the rocket barrage came in, rockets landed here and here, and things were coming in from this general direction. I won't go through this. So let's take a look at the area where this crater was. Here's the crater seen from a drone. This is north. This is the wind movement as determined by the weather. I'll assume that the weather is the best indicator of the direction of wind at the time of the attack. And what we see here is that there should have been massive casualties if there was a significant release point, because this was a well built up area. Immediately, not hundreds of meters down in another direction, but immediately adjacent to the bombed area, to the supposed allegedly bombed area. Here we see people in the crater. This is the crater formed by an exploding artillery rocket, not by a sarin bomb, because this crater would be still filled with moist sarin in the soil. Sarin behaves a lot like water. So if these guys came in a few hours later with these masks, which have no effect on gas, sarin gas, they'd be dead. No question about it. This, you know. All right. So how do we know the direction of this artillery rocket? Well, we see from this manual. I can give you blow-ups of the manual for those of you who want it. This is verification of minefields, explosive remnants of war and crater analysis from the UN, a UN manual. So this is what the UN gives its peacekeepers when it deploys them, and it explains how to identify and determine the direction of a rocket from an artillery fire from the shape of the crater. Here is the crater. This is the Khan Sheikhoun crater. Notice it's got exactly the shape shown in the UN manual. And if we look at the crater with an overlay from the UN manual, we can see that the crater has the same general shape. The length of the crater will change because the angle of impact and of the exploding munition will cause the crater to be a little longer or shorter. The crater will be deep at the front because that's where the explosion starts digging the crater, the explosion of the warhead. The shrapnel from the warhead, the fragments from the warhead are thrown out in bands, in very narrow bands. So this means that this cabinet, this transformer cabinet that was supposed to be hit, according to the experts, these were no experts. I want to be very clear. These were not experts. They claimed that these experts supposedly claimed there had to be fragment damage on these cabinets because the fragmentation from an exploding rocket would have put fragments into it. But that's clearly not true. So let me just show you. Here's an example of the fragmentation pattern from a rocket warhead, from an exploding rocket warhead in Mariupol. You can see the line of damage from the fragment, from the fragmenting warhead is very well defined, very well defined. There's nothing out here. Things you see out here is just fires and stuff that were initiated. So the basic situation is that there was no bomb dropped. This was a rocket that exploded in the pavement. It was misidentified by people who falsely identified themselves as experts. I have talked to several, I want to underscore, several US military officers who are artillery officers, and every one of them agreed instantly that this was an artillery crater. So if you have an artillery officer, an officer who specializes in artillery, their lives depend on identifying these craters and finding out the direction from which an enemy is firing. If you had a bomb fall, the bomb would have left debris of all kinds around the crater. There was no debris, none at all. There was a little cap that people were talking about. They may as well put a roll of toilet paper there and claim that that was an indication of the bomb. Here's even a Scud. The Scud comes in at Mach 5.5, and you can see the carcass of this Scud is landed on the desert in Saudi Arabia. So the idea that there would be no debris from a bomb that was a sarin-filled bomb is totally ridiculous. I want to underscore that. I'm not trying to be nasty. I'm just saying it's just absurd. Anybody who claims that is not an expert as they claim. So let me just end here and simply say there is absolutely no evidence, none. The OPCW's own evidence shows that nothing at all they claim of a technical nature in this report is supported by their own evidence. And I'll end here. Thank you. This is a repeat of the Duma report, incidentally. It's the same character.
I would like to thank Professor Postol, and before giving the floor to Security Council members that asked to speak, I wanted to say that we could have brought more briefers to today's meeting, but we thought it would be a little bit excessive, you know, time limitations, etc. But I must assure you that if we talk about these issues seriously and on a scientific basis, there are a lot of other experts and briefers that could tell us about these things which make the report that led to attacks on southern Syria look like a pretext for it. We knew it a long time. We just wanted you to hear not from us, but from people who master the scientific expertise in these matters. And now I would like to give the floor to Security Council members. And first, I would like to give the floor to the to Ambassador of the United States, Kelly Craft. You have the floor, Kelly.
Thank you, Vasily. Earlier this month, Russia requested that the Security Council's monthly video teleconference on Syria chemical weapons takes place in an open format. The United States welcomes these opportunities to expose the world the hypocrisy and disinformation Russia continues to spread and its attempts to shield the Assad regime from its accountability for its continued chemical weapons attacks. In 2013, this council adopted Resolution 2118, welcoming the framework for the elimination of Syrian chemical weapons. That framework, brokered by Russia and the United States, sought to, and I quote, ensure the destruction of the Syrian chemical weapons program in the soonest and safest manner. Further, the framework set the first half of the 2014 as the target date for completing elimination of all categories of chemical weapons material and equipment. Contrary to the facts before our own eyes, Russia would have us believe that the Assad regime has complied. In the real world, since the adoption of Resolution 2118, the Assad regime has used chemical weapons repeatedly to kill and to terrorize the Syrian people. The regime's use of chemical weapons is well documented and confirmed by the former OPCW, UN Joint Investigative Mechanism, and most recently, the OPCW's, Investigation and Identification Team. According to OPCW reports, the regime has declined to cooperate fully with the OPCW, refused to address numerous discrepancies, and failed to disclose and destroy its chemical weapons program. Taken together, these reports are further evidence of Syria's non-compliance with the Chemical Warfare Convention and Resolution 2118, and its utter disregard for human life and international norms and standards. The Assad regime has failed to comply with its international obligations related to the use of chemical weapons, including those it took when it voluntarily became party of the CWC. These obligations under Resolution 2118 are also binding on the regime. The Assad regime's non-compliance with these obligations poses a direct threat to the Syrian people and must change. As long as the Assad regime refuses to change its behavior, the Syrian people will remain at risk. The prospect of a peaceful political resolution to this conflict that is in line with the Security Council Resolution 2254 will remain out of reach, and Syria will remain a threat to security and stability in the region. Let's recognize today's demonstration for what it is, a stunt. The question we must ask ourselves is, why is Russia so eager to protect a regime that has repeatedly used chemical weapons against its own people? What are we seeing here today is another desperate and failed attempt by Russia to spread further disinformation, attack the professional work of the OPCW, and distract
I'm an American
from ongoing...
citizen. I'll be happy to talk with you privately. You should answer my letters. I'm an American citizen.
Mr. Chair, are you going to take control?
Kelly, please continue. Mr. Postol, we will give you time to react to it. Kelly, please continue.
Thanks, Vasily. What we are seeing here today is another desperate and failed attempt by Russia to spread disinformation, attack the professional work of the OPCW, and distract from an ongoing effort by responsible nations to hold the Assad regime accountable for its use of chemical weapons and numerous other atrocities. We have seen this performance before. It is getting old, and it does not work. The world can see what is happening. Let me say a word about the Assad regime and Russia's smear campaign against the Syria civil defense. The white helmets are heroic first responders that the United States is proud to support. I had the honor of personally meeting the white helmets in March on the Turkish-Syrian border. These brave humanitarian heroes knowingly put themselves in harm's way every day to save people from barbaric attacks on civilians by the Assad regime and its allies. They told me how they kissed their children goodbye every day before heading out the door, not knowing if they will return home. The sacrifice of the white helmet should be celebrated for all of us because these men and women are on the front line every day, whether it is helping protect communities from COVID-19 or diving into the rubble of a school or an apartment building after an airstrike. To suggest that they are anything short of heroic is unconscionable. To conclude, as we have stated previously, the United States expresses its unequivocal condemnation of the use of chemical weapons in Syria or anywhere else. We also call on Russia to stop enabling and defending the Assad regime, a serial violator of international obligations and human rights. This council must act to enforce Resolution 2118 and uphold the norm against the use of chemical weapons to ensure that those who have used them are held to account. The use of chemical weapons by any state presents an unacceptable threat to all states. Thank you.
I am obliged to thank the distinguished representative from the United States for her statement. From it, the participants may witness that we enjoy the pluralism of opinions in the Security Council, but we engaged in this conversation not for a propaganda stunt, but exactly to seriously discuss issues that we are facing at this file for more than 6 or more years. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of France, its permanent representative, Nicolas de Rivière. Nicolas, please.
Thank you very much, Vasily. First of all, I would like to thank the Russian Federation and China. Proposing to hold an Arria formula meeting is very rare on their part. I noticed that this is becoming a habit on the Syrian chemical file, I just regret that today's meeting is reduced to a disinformation exercise. Let me first of all recall the obvious. At the root of today's discussion is a very simple and plain fact that the Syrian regime in August 2013 gassed 1,300 men, women, and children to strengthen its military hand. And this is not disputed by anyone. Since then, sarin, chlorine, and other chemical weapons have been used and continue to be used in Syria and elsewhere. The emergence of chemical weapons in the world, and not just in Syria, is one of the most serious threats we face today. This is why I regret that every time the Assad regime is incriminated, systematic efforts are undertaken to protect it, to sow confusion and paralyze international action. In 2017, the renewal of the Joint Investigation Mechanism, the JIM, was blocked 3 times by a veto. Today, the OPCW's investigation and identification team is being discredited under the guise of a so-called scientific expertise because it's doing precisely what the international community expects of it. It is investigating incidents and identifying those responsible in a fully professional, impartial, and independent manner. Its report, published on 8 April on the chemical weapon attacks in La Tamneh, is particularly damning for the regime's Air Force units. In 2013, the Syrian regime committed itself to cooperate in transparency and good faith with the OPCW. And it must be said, the regime has not kept its word. It is high time for it to shed light on the state of its stocks. At France's initiative, the OPCW's Executive Council decided last July to give Syria 90 days to redress the situation. There is still time. We call on Syria to cooperate without delay with the OPCW Secretariat and to reveal its military chemical program. 23 years ago, the OPCW was created to be a pillar of our collective global security. It has proven its value. It is disgraceful to seek to discredit it on the pretext that its conclusions are not consistent with the versions of the facts that Syria and some permanent members of the Security Council wants to give. Mr. President, the use of chemical weapons is a crime that threatens all humanity. As you know, this is also a threat to international peace and security, as this Council unanimously stated in its presidential statement from November 2019. There can be no impunity. This is why we support the international independent and impartial mechanism, and this is why France is leading the international partnership against impunity for the use of chemical weapons. All countries that so wish can join this partnership, which is neither an anti-Syrian instrument nor a club of countries. Through this commitment, they will demonstrate their commitment to the law, international stability, and justice. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished ambassador of France, and now I'd like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. Jonathan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm just going to start, if I might, by saying to you, Vasily, that I thought it was disappointing that Russia only confirmed today to members of this council the identity of your briefers. I felt that treated the council with disrespect, and there was no need to do so unless, I suppose, perhaps you were hoping to secure other briefers. But I want to say that we fundamentally disagree with the distorted narrative set out in the concept note and by today's briefers. In the concept note, the organizers have sought to present as fact various unfounded and untrue propositions. That Syria completely destroyed its chemical weapons program in 2014, that Syria has not used chemical weapons since then, that any claims that they have are part of some kind of Western plot, and that the OPCW, the United Nations, and their reports are biased, lack integrity, or are rife with malpractice. By doing so, colleagues, the organizers want you to discount, doubt, and disbelieve the evidence before your eyes. And they want you, in a small way, to become complicit in protecting the Assad regime from accountability for atrocities committed against the Syrian people. But I think it's worth reminding ourselves of the actual evidence facts that have been presented to us by the United Nations and the OPCW over the past 7 years. So in 7 years, the Syrian authorities have still failed to provide a complete and consistent declaration of their chemical weapons program, as required by Security Council Resolution 2118 and the Chemical Weapons Convention, as required by international law. The OPCW Director General has made clear that there remain serious, outstanding gaps and inconsistencies in Syria's chemical weapons declaration. The fate of more than 400 tons of chemical weapon agent and precursors and thousands of munitions are unclear. Furthermore, since the initial declaration, the OPCW UN Joint Investigative Mechanism and now the OPCW's Investigation and Identification Team have found the Syrian authorities responsible for using chemical weapons on no fewer than 7 occasions, including in Khan Sheikhoun and Latamina in 2017. The OPCW has presented evidence in thorough and methodical reports. The first IIT report sets out the details of an exhaustive and rigorous 9-month investigation. The report was clear on its methodology, the evidential standard applied, and the wide range of scenarios considered, and the reasons for accepting or discounting them. The IIT simply found that there was no evidence to support other explanations, such as those offered by Syria and Russia. Now, colleagues, it's important to bear in mind that neither the Russian Federation nor their Syrian clients are unbiased actors without an agenda. Both have recently used chemical weapons. The Syrians extensively in their own country against their own people, and the Russian Federation in a failed assassination attempt in the United Kingdom, which tragically led to the murder of a British citizen. And Russia has grave questions to answer about the attempted assassination of Alexei Navalny with a nerve agent last month. It's against this backdrop that they have attempted to undermine the OPCW and the international architecture designed to prevent the use of these abhorrent weapons. We've been presented with so-called evidence of OPCW malpractice by individuals who were not fully party to investigations, could not accept that their views were not backed by the evidence, and who then breached their confidentiality obligations to the OPCW. We've been presented with the results of investigations by so-called independent Russian NGOs, such as the Foundation for the Study of Democracy, with questionable or non-existent expertise in the analysis of chemical weapons attacks. These presentations have included various unconvincing theories about canisters, apertures, trays of glasses, and the strength of beds. We've been subjected to lengthy conspiracy theories from journalists whose Twitter feed reveals all that council members need to know about the supposedly independent nature of their reporting, and from academics whose theories have been dismissed by their better qualified peers. We are told every month by Russia that the IIT findings cannot be trusted because the decision to create it was controversial, despite it being created in full accordance with the Chemical Weapons Convention. We've been told it's untrustworthy because it's geographically imbalanced, despite its members coming from all geographic groups, and in any case, acting as independent professionals. Various inconsistent positions have been put forward regarding individual incidents. For example, Syria and Russia have repeatedly changed their story about Khan Sheikhoun. First, they claimed there had been no release of toxic chemicals in Khan Sheikhoun. Then they claimed they had inadvertently hit a terrorist chemical weapons dump creating toxic chemicals which were not sarin. Then Syria finally handed over samples and admitted that sarin was released, but said it was someone else who did it, although they didn't mention goats. The IIT report highlights the fact that the sarin used in attacks on Khan Sheikhoun and Latamina matched the declared Syria stockpile. An analysis showed it was Syria's own sarin. Indeed, on the 5th of July 2017, the Russian ambassador to the OPCW, Alexander Shulgin, said, After reviewing the report on the incident in Khan Sheikhoun, only one thing is clear: either sarin or a sarin-like substance was in fact used there. And yet at the open Syria CW briefing on the 10th of September this year, Vasily Nebenzia said the use of sarin at that case was even more than questionable. The Russian playbook, colleagues, is to throw mud in all directions and see what sticks. They undermine independent expertise for their own self-interest. Don't let them do it, colleagues. Over the past 7 years, the OPCW has worked tirelessly to assist Syria with resolving the outstanding issues in its declaration. Through its fact-finding missions, it has investigated incidents of chemical weapons use and has been tasked first by the Security Council as part of the Joint Investigative Mechanism and subsequently by the Executive Council to carry out the important task of identifying the perpetrators of chemical weapons use. While carrying out these vital tasks, the OPCW has found itself under sustained attack, including an attempted Russian GRU cyber attack in 2018. Rather than use its privileged platform to persuade its Syrian clients to resolve the gaps and inconsistencies in their chemical weapons declaration and to stop using these weapons, Russia simply attempts, as today, to discredit the OPCW and its multinational staff. Colleagues, the awful poisoning of Russian opposition politician Alexei Navalny by Novichok, a banned chemical weapon, reminds us of the importance of the OPCW and the importance of the non-proliferation regime. It is unconscionable that any government can even think of using chemical weapons against its own people or indeed against anyone else. The Syrian regime has repeatedly shown it is willing to do so. Members of this council have a particular responsibility to protect the non-proliferation regime and to ensure these abhorrent weapons are not used with impunity. We owe it to the victims and to potential future victims to realize this responsibility and to act on the basis of moral principle. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. On the announcement of experts, indeed, it came only today and not for a reason, not without a reason. And reasons are serious, including their security. You may not imagine that sitting here in the council, in our cozy seats, that some of those experts, not only those that are present here, but elsewhere, are receiving life threats for their position, by the way. And on who is biased in this situation, we have our own opinion, which we stated many times over. I will not be repeating it here, since I'm a chair and I'm not supposed to engage in polemics in this meeting. The meeting was not dedicated not to my exchange with my colleagues. We have enough of that elsewhere. I will reserve that for some later time. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished ambassador of Germany, Christoph Heusgen. Christoph, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Vasily. The Yiddish language has a word that entered the English language, and one of the words that the English language has taken is chutzpah. I know you all know what chutzpah means. And I think this is what best describes today's event. As a German idealist, when I saw that we have the OPCW on the agenda, I thought, well, this is very good because now finally our Russian friends, and I saw that they are joined by our Chinese friends, that they have now as an ambition to strengthen the chemical weapons convention, that they want to support the OPCW, that they will jointly with us remind the Syrian regime that they have to comply with 2118 and that they have to cooperate also with the IIT. But when I read the concept note, I said that again our idealism is not at the right place, because again, what is the objective here? And there is what I say about chutzpah is that, again, Russia and China are trying to undercut the credibility of the OPCW, trying to present alternative facts, trying to spread doubts in order, again, to undercut this. And this is, unfortunately, a Russian tactics that we have seen when they are caught or when their friends are caught of committing crimes or violating international law, then they go into counter-offensive and trying to have alternative facts or alternative reasoning just to, and also defending, as I said, their friends. So coming back to the concept note, when you read the concept note, when you know about the Chemical Weapons Convention and what happened in China, you are really disappointed, Vasily, that there is nothing about the reasons why discuss it. There's nothing about the more than 1,000 victims who died the horrible death of the when the Syrian population used chemical weapons against them. There is no mourning of the victims here, just as last week when we had the Syria on the agenda. There is no compassion on your side for the hundreds and thousands of victims that have been tortured in Assad's prisons, and there is no emotion there when the witnesses from the trial in Koblenz are quoted, where about all the mass graves that have been detected there. Going back to the OPCW and the concept note, there is nothing about the victims. There is nothing about what Jonathan just said about the insufficient declaration of Syrian stock. There is nothing about Syria continuing after 2013 employing chemical weapons. There's nothing about the undercutting by Russia of the JIM. There's nothing about the reasons why Russia and China fight OPCW's vast majorities that want to try hard to bring the perpetrators out, find the perpetrators who are responsible for the use of chemical weapons. There's nothing about when they are criticizing the IIT, and Jonathan just mentioned the composition. There was an IID earlier this year under Estonian presidency to discuss the IIT, and Russia and China decided not to participate in this chance to learn more about this. Again, there is nothing in the concept note about the cyber attack that Russian intelligence officers committed in 2018 in The Hague against the OPCW headquarters, and where the Russian cyber, when they were caught. There is nothing in the concept note, and it was just mentioned by Jonathan, that Russia itself is using chemical weapons and trying to hide that, and only need to remind to the poisoning of Mr. Skripal and his daughter, of the use of Novichok against Mr. Navalny, or another chemical that was used, polonium, against Mr. Litvinenko. Unfortunately, Russia is always trying to cover up these crimes and trying to have the use of chemical weapons accepted as a new normal, and spread misinformation and change narratives regularly, and cover up the murders. And when Vasily, you just said, or Vasily is no longer listening, but Dimitri, when Vasily said, well, there are death threats were against the speakers here, the briefers. Talking about death threats received, let me use this occasion to honor the memory of Anna Politkovskaya, the journalist and critic of the war in Chechnya, and the critic of corruption in Russia, and who was killed in Russia. And Russia was sentenced 2 years ago by the European Council on European Court on Human Rights for not uncovering the background to this. And also, let me remind, talking about death threats, let me remind you of Natalia Estemirova, the journalist, the human rights activist who was killed in 2009. Until today, no, the perpetrator were not found. And also, let's honor the 300 deaths of MH17 victims of a Russian book missile. Again, Russia covering up and presenting alternative facts. We heard Dimitri Vasily the other day, criticizing Germany for not reacting immediately on the request for legal assistance. And I wish Russia would react and react to the request for legal assistance, and helping to see that Igor Girkin, the Russian instigator and the man behind the Russian occupation of Donbass, who was online celebrated the downing of MH17, is finally standing trial. But let's go back to the Chemical Weapons Convention and Russia's use of Novichok. So after Navalny was poisoned, Russian misinformation and alternative facts set in again, and other countries were made responsible for the poisoning. And at some stage, in my country, Germany was made responsible. Now there is something, so I wanted also to quote it because it's also funny. According to Le Monde and the New York Times, President Putin offered another explanation, suggesting that Navalny may have poisoned himself. And Navalny in social media reacted to this, and he said that it's a good theory. I think it's worth the closest study. Navalny said, I boiled Novichok in the kitchen, quietly took a sip of it in the plane and fell into a coma, he continued. Before that, I agreed with my wife, friends, and colleagues that if the health ministry insisted on taking me to Germany, that they would never permit that to happen. Dying in an Omsk hospital and ending up in an Omsk morgue where the cause of death would be listed as lived long enough was the ultimate goal of my cunning plan. But Putin, he said, outplayed me. Again, chutzpah, I said this before. I want to end my gloomy intervention on a positive note. Really, this council has the responsibility to prevent such heinous crimes to happen again, as we saw in Syria. We must support and not undercut OPCW, and the OPCW is the best ally in the fight against violations of the Chemical Weapons Convention. And we must not accept that the use of chemical weapons becomes a new normal, not in Syria, not in Salisbury, and not in Omsk. Thank you very much, Vasily.
I thank Christoph for his gloomy intervention, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, we would like to thank the briefers for their presentation. Not long after the accession of the Syrian Arab Republic to the CWC and the adoption of the Resolution 2118 by the Security Council, the OPCW confirmed the destruction of the stockpiles and all 27 chemical weapons production facilities declared by the Syrian Arab Republic. Despite this landmark success, however, there have been recurring allegations of the use of chemical weapons and several reports by different OPCW investigative teams, which confirm that indeed some of those incidents have taken place and provided compelling evidence of the chemical agents utilized and how the attacks were perpetrated. Hence, this scenario brings us to the conclusion that stocks of toxic chemical agents, particularly sarin
Well, I think we have a connection issue with the Dominican Republic. What I suggest I will do, I will give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belgium now, and then we'll return back to the Dominican Republic after we reconnect. Belgium, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I hope that you hear me loud and clear. Thank you for convening this area on a very important topic of the implementation of Resolution 2118, or more concretely, on the use of chemical weapons by Syria. This is indeed an urgent and important topic that requires the continued attention of this Council, as it is a clear threat against peace and security. Mr. President, I will make 3 points. First, some claim that Syria has destroyed its chemicals that can be used as weapons and that it does not maintain any capabilities. Syria ratified the Convention for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in 2013, after the Ghouta chemical attack that claimed hundreds of lives. Up to this day, Syria's chemical weapons declaration remains incomplete. The Syrian authorities have not provided sufficient explanations for the gaps and inconsistencies in its initial declaration, even after 22 consultations with the OPCW Declaration Assessment Team. The completion of the declaration is not a merely technical matter. Any ambiguity in the declaration leaves open the possibility of Syria maintaining stockpiles and again using chemical agents as weapons against its own people. Meanwhile, the OPCW fact-finding mission has concluded that chemical weapons have been used or likely used in at least 18 instances. The IIT report, which confirms the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian Air Force in Al-Tamena in 2017, is a further confirmation of this. This lays out a wider pattern of behavior. Violence against the population is part of Syria's military strategy, whereby even medical facilities become targets. Finally, following Resolution 2118 adopted by the Security Council in 2013, Syria must extend its full cooperation to the OPCW Secretariat and all issues related to its chemical weapons program. This is currently not the case. This brings me to my second point, Mr. President. Some question the central position of the OPCW in the fight against the use of chemical weapons. The issue of chemical weapons is of a particular importance to my country, since the first massive chemical attack took place in April 1915 at the Battle of Ypres, claiming thousands of victims. This explains Belgium's particular attachment to the norm of a total ban on the use of chemical weapons that the OPCW is responsible for enforcing. It is nothing more than the duty of the OPCW to demand and obtain compliance with Syria's obligations. Some have erroneously tried to cast doubt on the professionalism, impartiality, and objectivity of the OPCW Technical Secretariat and the quality of its work. Yet the rigor of the methods used by the OPCW, including the IIT, are the best arguments to refute this criticism. As a member of the Executive Council as of today, the OPCW can support and count on us. Finally, Mr. President, some remain silent about accountability. Beyond the measures taken by the OPCW, the perpetrators of these crimes should be held accountable, as this is essential to prevent the re-emergence of chemical weapons. It is the responsibility of the international community to support all procedures and bodies that can contribute to this goal of justice, such as a AAAM. The fight against impunity has been at the heart of Belgium's actions for many years. The use of chemical weapons in international conflicts has been a war crime within the meaning of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court since its creation. In 2010, Belgium successfully proposed an amendment to make the use of chemical weapons punishable as a war crime, also in non-international armed conflicts. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belgium, and now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Estonia, Ambassador Sven Jurgensen. Sven, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. You know, after reading the concept paper of today's meeting and listening to the briefers, I understand that the aim of this meeting was to be nothing more than a propaganda exercise to undermine the credibility and professionalism of the OPCW, and thereby absolve the Syrian regime of responsibility for the most heinous crimes. Let me be clear. Estonia fully supports the OPCW Technical Secretariat and has full confidence in the work of its investigative mechanisms. I heard nothing today that makes me doubt in the OPCW investigative methods and conclusions, or the organization's ability to implement its mandate. I will take this opportunity now to address the implementation of the Security Council Resolution 2118, which in several aspects remains inadequate. I will focus on 3 points of concern, and Estonia also aligns itself with a statement presented later today by Denmark on behalf of a group of Nordic Baltic countries. First, Resolution 2118 stipulates that the Syrian Arab Republic shall not use, develop, produce, otherwise acquire, stockpile, or retain chemical weapons. It is now the 10th year of human tragedy in Syria. During these 10 years, Syrian regime has repeatedly used chemical weapons for their strategic aims to suppress opposition and terrorize its people. We have seen this in Ghouta, Douma, Sarmin, Khan Sheikhoun, and elsewhere. The UN OPCW Joint Investigative Mechanism has determined 4 instances where the Syrian regime has used chemical weapons against its own people. Most recently, the OPCW investigation and identification team concluded that the Syrian Arab Air Force were responsible for 3 chemical weapons attacks against the Syrian people in Tamena in March 2017. It is not the case, as argued by Russia, that it is the Western countries' baseless claim that the Syrian government continues to use chemical weapons. The use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime against its own people is proven by consistent and solid evidence provided by the best experts in this field. It is unfortunate that Russia and China chose not to attend the Security Council meeting in May during the Estonian presidency, where the OPCW Director General Arrias and the IIT coordinator Ambassador Oñate came to brief the Council on the results of the first IIT report. Otherwise, they would have heard explanations about the mandate and criteria for the creation of the IIT, its working methods, and that proper consideration was given to different hypotheses of what had happened. Second, in Resolution 2118, the Security Council determined that the use of chemical weapons anywhere constitutes a threat to international peace and security, and expressed its strong conviction that those individuals responsible for the use of chemical weapons must be held accountable. In the face of clear evidence of the use of chemical weapons, the Security Council has an obligation to act and respond decisively. Regrettably, so far, it has greatly failed to do so. All attempts in the Council to move towards accountability for the use of chemical weapons in Syria have been blocked by the Russian Federation's veto. Estonia welcomes the OPCW Executive Council decision of 9th of July, which condemned the findings of the IIT report and provided a deadline for Syria to comply with its obligations and the Chemical Weapons Convention. Estonia also continues to support accountability mechanisms that a wide UN membership has put in place to combat impunity. We emphasize our strong support for the international, impartial, and independent mechanism and the Commission of Inquiry. We also support the French Partnership Against Impunity. Impunity cannot be an option when we talk about the use of weapons of mass destruction. Finally, I want to return to the issue of systematic and targeted attempts to undermine the OPCW Technical Secretariat and its investigative mechanisms. This has a direct bearing to the international architecture against the use of chemical weapons and is not conducive to the implementation of Resolution 2118. The overarching aim of the Russian and Syrian disinformation campaigns is to sow distrust against the most competent organization to deal with chemical weapons, because this organization has come to conclusions which are inconvenient for them. This is done by using contradictory, incoherent, and malicious arguments in regards to the OPCW reports and its experts. Efforts to undermine the OPCW include even attempts to break into its computer systems. The aim of spreading the conspiracy theories is to make us believe that nothing is certain and nothing can be trusted anymore. The aim is to fracture the international chemical non-proliferation regime, to shield the brutal actions of the Syrian regime, but perhaps even to shield the actions of one's own. In this regard, we urge Russia to cooperate closely with the OPCW and provide an account how the nerve agent Novichok came to be used in the poisoning of Mr. Navalny. Mr. Chair, the use of chemical weapons presents a serious security threat to all states. Members of this council have an obligation to prevent the use of weapons of mass destruction, not to encourage it or enable it. Thank you.
I would like to thank the distinguished ambassador of Estonia. Since he is the second who mentioned our so-called non-participation in the event that the Estonian presidency organized in May, I would like to briefly remind the delegations that the reason why we didn't participate was because the Estonian presidency chose to go to a closed format to protect the OPCW leadership from unpleasant questions that we were preparing them in the open format. And the open format was not envisaged, and that was the reason why we didn't participate. Otherwise, we would be happy to expose the malpractices of the OPCW that showed in the recent times, but they chose to guard themselves behind closed doors. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Vasily. At the onset, we would like to reiterate that South Africa condemns any use of chemical weapons by anyone under any circumstances. We believe that no cause can ever justify the use of any weapon of mass destruction by any actor. We oppose any use of chemical weapons, and we are committed to our international obligations as a state party to the CWC, as well as a member of the OPCW. In our view, it is imperative that the CWC states parties must continue to have confidence in the impartiality of the OPCW as the only technically competent international authority in its area of work, and that there should be no political interference in the work of the OPCW. CWC states parties should therefore unite in preserving the international norm against chemical weapons and adherence to the provisions of the CWC and its consistent and non-discriminatory implementation. South Africa will therefore continue to work towards preventing any politicization of these relevant multilateral instruments, whilst at the same time holding states parties accountable for any non-compliance with their obligations based on clear evidence. I thank you, Chairperson.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa. I hear Dominican Republic reconnected, and I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic.
Thank you, Ambassador. You can hear me now? Okay, my apologies for the interruption earlier. I want to thank the briefers for their presentation this afternoon. Not sure if I got to say that earlier. Not long after the accession of the Syrian Arab Republic to the CWC and the adoption of Resolution 2118 by the Security Council, the OPCW confirmed the destruction of the stockpiles and all 27 chemical weapons production facilities declared by the Syrian Arab Republic. Despite this landmark success, however, there have been recurring allegations of the use of chemical weapons and several reports by different OPCW investigative teams, which confirm that indeed some of those incidents have taken place and provided compelling evidence of the chemical agents utilized in how the attacks were perpetrated. Hence, this scenario brings us to the conclusion that stocks of toxic chemical agents, particularly sarin and chlorine, remain in the Syrian Arab Republic, and we simply cannot deny their existence. In this regard, the Dominican Republic continues to call on Syria to fully cooperate with the OPCW with a view to finding a tangible resolution to the long-pending issues, including those related to its initial declaration, as it is clear that it failed to declare and destroy the total of its chemical arsenals. We understand that the collaboration in good faith with Syria, with the OPCW, is paramount to put this matter to rest, and so is the cooperation of the Council members. Therefore, it is imperative that the Council return to consensus on this issue and work constructively in order to reflect the necessary advances. Our fundamental collective aim should be to prevent the use of toxic chemical agents as weapons ever again, to completely destroy their stocks, and to identify the perpetrators and hold them accountable for their crimes, without distinction of whether non-state or state actors could be implicated. For this purpose, and to uphold the chemical weapons and non-proliferation regime and the authority of the OPCW, we need to place our full confidence on the professional work of the OPCW and provide it with our complete and unwavering support while leaving political agendas aside. By undermining the work of the OPCW and its team of professionals, FFM, DAT, JIM, IIT, is not the way to achieve our general objective. Moreover, we understand that as members of the Convention, all states have the obligation to comply with agreed commitments without prejudice and abide by the decisions of its mandated organisms, including the Conference of State Parties and the Executive Council. In this vein, we encourage Syria to obtain the assistance from the Technical Secretariat in order to work on the arrangements to meet the demands contained in the Executive Council's decision of 9 July, based on the troubling findings of the first IIT report. Mr. Chair, the Dominican Republic reiterates its principled and firm position of condemnation of the use of chemical weapons anywhere, by anyone, and under any circumstances. Their use is unjustifiable, constitutes a flagrant violation of international law and of the Convention. Likewise, it represents an irrefutable threat to international peace and security. So preventing their use is not only a responsibility of the Syrian Arab Republic, but also of the international community. Accordingly, we urge all members to provide their full support and cooperation in this regard and comply with their commitments in accordance with the Convention, as well as with relevant Security Council resolutions. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic, and now I have the distinguished representative of Vietnam on my list.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chair, at the outset, I would like to thank the briefers for sharing their views on the chemical weapons issues relating to Syria. Mr. Chair, Vietnam shares the standpoint of state parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention in condemning the use of these weapons in any form, by anyone, anywhere, under any circumstances, and for any reason. We believe that we all share the same goal on the matter of chemical weapons in Syria, which is to fully implement the CWC and the Resolution 2118, the theme of the Arria Formula meeting hosted by Russia and China today. It is, however, regrettable that there are substantial disagreements among relevant parties on this issue. To address these issues, we are of the view that there is no better way than to enhance dialogue and cooperation, promote engagement with relevant stakeholders in a most constructive and non-politicized manner. Mr. Chair, we would like to underline that it is the state parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention that have the primary responsibility to implement obligations under the convention. In this regard, we support the OPCW in discharging its mandate given by the CWC and state parties, including its technical support to state parties. In so doing, the OPCW and all of its relevant bodies and mechanisms have to strictly abide by the convention. Chemical weapons attacks also have to be fully addressed in order to prevent recurrence of the disastrous consequences of chemical weapons that innocent civilians suffered. To do so, investigation in any possible use of chemical weapon must be conducted in a most comprehensive, objective, and impartial manner in order to provide irrefutable evidence. And we hope that today's discussion between the briefers, council members, and the wider membership will be beneficial to putting an end to this long-standing issue in the council. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of Vietnam, and now I'd like to give the floor to the distinguished permanent representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. Bashar, you have the floor. Bashar, you have the floor.
Thank you. Do you hear me? Thank you very much, Vasily. Allow me at the outset to thank my colleague, Ambassador Zhang Jun, and your good self for organizing this very important meeting. I would like also to thank the briefers for the information and insight they provided us with. I really appreciate the efforts of friendly member states in the Security Council that seek to distance this sensitive file from politicized considerations. However, this will not be an easy task, as the OPCW Technical Secretariat and UN Office for Disarmament Affairs are fulfilling Western political agendas due to the immense pressure by some member states led by the United States, the UK, and France, and Germany, in order to maintain the chemical weapons file as a tool of pressure and blackmail against my country, Syria, and against Russia. The same hostile governments continue their attempts to cast artificial doubts about the solid and established facts, which prove that the Syrian Arab Republic no longer possesses any chemical weapons and that it has not and will not use them. Furthermore, they refuse to admit that the activities of the Joint Investigative Mechanism, JIM, and the Fact-Finding Mission, FFM, along with their reports, were neither impartial, professional, nor balanced, but rather failed to provide scientific and factual documented evidence of any accusation leveled against Syria. Not to mention the remote Hollywood investigations conducted by the JIM and the FFM without visiting the crime scene, and the failure of the authors of their reports to provide any proof or scientific evidence regarding the validity and integrity of the chain of custody of evidence that has been used in directing false accusations against the Syrian Arab Republic. Having said that, allow me to take advantage of the presence of scientific experts with us in this meeting in order to benefit from their experience regarding some questions that OPCW TS is still trying to avoid answering. Number one, to what extent the criteria for the reliability of the chain of custody apply to the methods used by experts of JIM and FFM when they remotely investigated some of the incidents in Syria from Turkey? And how can they rely on so-called open sources and terrorist entities, namely the White Helmets terrorist organization, who happened to be the first to be present where the alleged crimes took place, and who happened to be the party that collected and transferred the so-called evidences? Two, how can anyone rely on the conclusions reached by the JIM and FFM while they used in their reports speculative and uncertain terms such as likely or unlikely while evaluating scientific and factual elements? Three, how can we explain that OPCW experts refused the Syrian request to collect samples from Al-Shuairat Air Base? As you know, the US claimed that this base was used in Khan Sheikhoun bombing in order to justify its aggression against it. In this regard, can technical experts explain the scientific possibility of bomb falling from a warplane over the alleged site of this accident while it was flying at a distance of 5 kilometers away from this site. 4. Regarding the alleged Duma incident, is it not scientifically impossible for a cylinder to fall from the sky and collide with the roofs of houses without exploding or being deformed? Even when it fell on a bed inside a room, no damage was caused, neither to the bed or the furniture, nor the glass in the room. Is it a miracle? And I'm thankful and grateful to both briefers who shed a light on this very important angle of the question. 5. How can the OPCW lose sensitive samples that were collected in order to solve the outstanding issues regarding the Syrian declaration? The OPCW-TS informed the Syrian side on June 22nd, 2020, about a leakage of these samples. Yet, until today, the OPCW-TS is unable to provide a clear explanation regarding this leakage. 6. Didn't massive legal and procedural violations and abuses occur when the OPCW violated the convention and established a so-called Investigation and Identification Team, IIT, in June 2018? I'm talking here about the non-consensual decision that was taken by an artificial majority and in the absence of the representatives of 87 member states from the vote. Allow me here, Mr. President, to invite all of you to read the report published by the Gray Zone entitled "Leaked Documents Expose Massive Syria Propaganda Operation Waged by Western Governments, Contractors and Media." This report reveals scandals about hundreds of millions of dollars that Western governments, namely the US and the UK, have spent from taxpayers' money to establish and finance platforms, networks, and media institutions, especially the White Helmets, in order to promote distorted media propaganda against the Syrian government. It seems that the school of Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, is still open until now, and many of its graduates hold higher degrees in the literature of lying, the art of distorting scientific facts, and sophisticated philosophy. Sophistry philosophy that is anti-science and specialist experts who know well what they are talking about. These scientists support their talk with scientific evidence based on long experience and moral principle that is against Goebbels' propaganda. Unfortunately, colleagues from the NATO alliance representatives in the Council insist to refuse opinions of scientists and attempt to empty the purpose of their talks. Insisting to wrongful allegations is even worse than wrong itself, because they refer to the misintentions, principally. Weak claim and absence of moral vision. History is full of series of scandals fabricated by some Goebbels Graduates Academy to destroy many member states, and I don't want to remind everyone about what happened about the invasion of Vietnam, the invasion of Cuba, the invasion of Iraq, Libya, and the attempts of invading my country, Syria, and other countries in this organization. So lying is lying. We in Syria are realistic, Mr. President, and pragmatic, and we will continue to work with the OPCW's Technical Secretariat with the limits of respecting and preserving the convention and without prejudice to our national sovereignty. And we believe that the time has come to permanently put an end to the manipulation and politicization of these files and close it for good. I thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished ambassador, permanent representative of Syria. I have to apologize and give the floor to the two council members that requested it before I gave the floor to the Syrian ambassador. I'd like to give the floor to Indonesia now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank the briefer for their briefings. It is indeed important to maintain our regular communications, particularly with regard to a specific issue that involves substantial gaps among us council members. The diverging views are not a secret, and they are thus far part of the process. What we need to do next is to reduce these particular gaps. My delegation believes that all parties want and need to close the Syrian chemical weapon dossier, and that nobody, and I repeat here, nobody wants the same incidents to reoccur in the future. Let me re-emphasize also that Indonesia believes that all alleged chemical incidents must undertake comprehensive and impartial investigations with the aim of having conclusive evidences in line with credible facts, of course. It is extremely important to continue and enhance coordination between the OPCW and the Syrian Arab Republic based on good faith and without politicizations of the issue. This is imperative to make progress on the Syrian chemical weapons dossier. Mr. Chairman, Indonesia was one among many delegations voted abstain during the special sessions of the Conference of the State Parties to the Chemical Weapon Convention on June 2018, establishing the IIT. Nevertheless, we continue to support the work of the OPCW, and we reiterate our support to the professionalism and credibility of the OPCW. We concur with others that the integrity of the OPCW team is critical, and we trust that the OPCW will do its utmost in this regard. Also, against this backdrop, Mr. Chairman, we would like to ask briefers whether they have inputs or maybe concrete proposals for the OPCW to strengthen its verification regime. We believe such concrete proposal might be important for the state parties to the convention to discuss possible measures in strengthening the convention verification regime, in particular during the next conference of the state parties of the conventions next November, or even beyond this annual gathering this year. Let me conclude, Mr. Chairman, by reiterating our principal positions in condemning any use of chemical weapons by any country, organizations, group of or states or person in any circumstances. The use of chemical weapons is unjustifiable and intolerable anywhere at any time. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the distinguished representative of Indonesia. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished permanent representative of Tunisia. Tarek, you have the floor.
Thank you, Vasily. At the outset, I thank the Russian Federation and China for organizing this meeting. Let me begin by reiterating Tunisia's steadfast commitment to the chemical disarmament and non-proliferation regime, at the core of which lies the Chemical Weapons Convention and its implementing body, the OPCW. The CWC prohibits a whole class of weapons of mass destruction under international verification, Security Council Resolution 2118 and OPCW Executive Council decisions came to reaffirm this requirement back in 2013 within the context of the Syrian Arab Republic. We commend the important work that has been done thus far by the OPCW to ensure elimination of Syria's declared chemical weapons arsenal. It is essential that substantive progress be made by the Syrian Arab Republic on its chemical weapons dossier to fully comply with its obligation. In this regard, we urge continued cooperation and dialogue between the Syrian Arab Republic and the OPCW Technical Secretariat in order to resolve all outstanding issues. It is also essential that all allegations of chemical weapons use in Syria undergo through impartial and transparent investigations in order to identify those responsible for such use, including non-state actors. The issue of alleged and actual use of chemical weapons by terrorist groups should be given due attention and follow up, in particular, as set out in Resolution 2118. Mr. Chair, upholding the authority of the OPCW entails strict adherence to the letter and spirit of the Chemical Weapons Convention, which created the organization. We emphasize that the CWC provides a comprehensive and well-balanced treaty with strong safeguards to addressing and resolving issues related to chemical disarmament and non-proliferation in multilateral, cooperative, and rules-based fashion, including on questions of compliance, lack thereof, and remedies thereto. As stated in the Chemical Weapons Convention, states should strive for consensus and take their decisions by consensus as far as possible. Every effort should be made to uphold the consensus-based culture of the OPCW. We regret that consensus has eroded at both the OPCW and the Security Council. Such eroded consensus would only undermine the norm against chemical weapons use and the arms control regime at wide. It is crucial for the international community that united in 2013 to adopt the framework for Syria chemical weapons, to act collectively and in unison so that this file is resolutely brought to closure. We continue to follow the ongoing process at the OPCW policy-making organs related to the question of compliance of Syria with its chemical obligations under the CWC and Resolution 2118 following the release of the first report of the IIT. The work of the OPCW and its member states should be given every opportunity to continue with full observance of the CWC provisions. Let me finally reiterate Tunisia's condemnation in the strongest terms of the use of chemical weapons anywhere under any pretext by anyone, be it a state or non-state actor. We emphasize that upholding the prohibition of chemical weapons used by the international community entails the attribution of responsibility of the perpetrators of such egregious use. We wish to also reiterate that the only lasting solution to the Syrian crisis is a Syrian-led, Syrian-owned, UN-facilitated political settlement in line with Security Council Resolution 2254 that ends terrorism and foreign intervention, safeguards Syria's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and unity, and meets Syria's legitimate aspirations for a free and dignified future. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Tunisia. Now we have concluded the list of Security Council members that wish to take the floor, and now I'll be giving the floor to those UN members who volunteered to intervene. I would request and I would strongly encourage that these member states speak in about 3 minutes, because we have a long list. And we need, in the end, to give the floor to our briefers to respond to the questions and to make their comments. I will be giving the floor in the order that I received online. And the first on my list is the distinguished representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Vasily. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic Baltic countries, Estonia, Finland, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, Norway, Sweden, and then, of course, my own country, Denmark. Mr. Chair, the re-emergence of chemical weapons is one of the most urgent threats to international peace and security, and has to be dealt with firmly and collectively. Impunity for breaches of the global norm against chemical weapons must not be tolerated. We condemn in the strongest possible terms the recent assassination attempt on Alexei Navalny, who was poisoned in Russia by a military chemical nerve agent of the Novichok group. Any use of chemical weapons under any circumstances is a clear breach of international law and contrary to the Chemical Weapons Conventions, which prohibits the use of all chemical weapons. We reiterate our call on Russia as a matter of urgency to be fully transparent and to bring those responsible to justice, bearing in mind Russia's commitment under the Chemical Weapons Convention. The prohibition on chemical weapons continues to be challenged deliberately and on the assumption of absence of accountability. But violations of the conventions must have consequences. It is exactly for this reason that a number of essential decisions, as foreseen by the Chemical Weapons Conventions, have been taken. The use of chemical weapons in the Syrian Arab Republic led to the establishment of the OPCW fact-finding mission and the joint investigative mechanism. Highly professional and competent bodies designed to deal with the use of chemical weapons. At the same time, it was clear that Syria had not fully declared its chemical weapons program. And to remedy this violation of the treaty, the OPCW established the Declarations Assessment Team. At a special session of the Conference of State Parties, it was decided to task the OPCW Technical Secretariat to set up arrangements to identify the perpetrators of the use of chemical weapons in the Syrian Arab Republic. This was a direct consequence of the Russian veto of the continuation of the joint investigative mechanism, just as it was beginning to deliver results. The Declarations Assessment Team, the fact-finding mission, and the Investigation and Identification Team are instrumental in preserving the integrity of our Chemical Weapons Convention and in upholding the global ban on chemical weapons. We commend the extraordinary high degree of professionalism of these mechanisms. The quality and competence of the staff is beyond reproach. Their tenacity and courage working in adverse and sometimes hostile or dangerous situations is admirable. The impartiality and integrity above questioning. We can only congratulate the OPCW Director General in having assembled teams of exceptional quality that complements his own efforts and that of the Technical Secretariat in general. We firmly reject attempts to discredit or bring into disrepute the OPCW and the work of the Technical Secretariat. Such attempts against international community's efforts in securing accountability and preventing use of chemical weapons are deeply concerning. To us, the law is clear. The decision set up mechanisms in order to investigate the facts in Syria are in full accordance with the convention. The investigations and the assessments by the fact-finding mission, by the Declarations and Assessment Team, and the investigative and intervention teams are well established and beyond any reasonable doubt. We strongly condemn the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian Arab Air Force as concluded by the first report of the OPCW Investigation and Identification Team. The Syrian Arab Republic should return to full compliance with the Chemical Weapons Convention in accordance with the clear and verifiable parameters as set up by the Executive Council in its decisions of 9th July. We reiterate full confidence in the expertise, objectivity, impartiality, and independence of the OPCW Technical Secretariat and its Investigation and Identification Team. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of Denmark. Thank you, Martin. Now I give the floor to the distinguished permanent representative of Latvia. Andres, you have the floor.
Thank you, dear Vasily. Honorable members of the Council, ladies and gentlemen, I am ordered to participate in this Arria formal meeting on pressing issue of the use of chemical weapons. My delegation was intrigued to hear about independent experts investigating OPCW's methods and conclusions. But to our disappointment, the information of briefers was not released until the very day of this debate. Furthermore, the interventions did not fulfill our expectations in an objective and impartial assessment of today's subject. Latvia aligns itself with the statement delivered by Denmark on behalf of the Nordic Baltic states and supports the statement by the PR of Estonia. We are gravely concerned by the repeated attempts by Syria and of a few other members, including of those of the permanent members of the Security Council, to challenge the authority and integrity of the OPCW. There is no doubt that the Director General and the Technical Secretariat, in spite of the challenges posed by the COVID-19 coronavirus, are fulfilling their duties in the service of the international community in a professional, objective, and impartial manner. We express our strong political support to this important organization and encourage all states parties to provide a predictable financial base for the future work of 2021. We are deeply concerned about the continued non-compliance by certain states with the international obligations on disarmament, non-proliferation, and control arms. This is why the EU strongly supported the establishment of international attribution mechanism to identify and hold accountable the perpetrators of the use of chemical weapons. Latvia condemns the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian Arab Air Force, as concluded by the first report of OPCW IAT this year. We support the decision that sets clear and verifiable parameters for action, and we urge the Syrian Arab Republic to take all measures required to redress the situation in the given time frame. Impunity for these heinous acts will not be tolerated. The use of chemical weapons is completely unacceptable under any circumstances. Thus, we express our outrage about the hypocrisy and cynicism of one of the founding members of the United Nations, holding a meeting on the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 2118, while independent specialized laboratories have confirmed the poisoning of opposition leader in Russia, Alexei Navalny, by a military chemical nerve agent of the Novichok group on its soil. Instead of fully cooperating and stepping up transparency, we are once more witnessing a page from Russian disinformation playbook. We saw it in 2018 in Salisbury case, and we see it now. We regret that Russia desperately attempts to allegedly link the origins of Novichok with other countries, including Latvia, while trying to avoid disclosing the circumstances of this assassination attempt and bringing those responsible for this criminal act to justice. The international community cannot remain silent when the UN Charter and fundamental principles of international law are manifestly violated. We call on Security Council, all member states, to demand accountability, a prompt investigation and justice to be served. An adequate response from the international society and relevant bodies should follow immediately. Latvia, together with other member states of the European Union, will continue to follow this issue closely and consider the implementation of OPCW recommendations in the wider context. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of Latvia, and now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Brazil would like to thank the Russian Federation for organizing this meeting, as well as the briefers for sharing their perspectives. First and foremost, allow me to reiterate Brazil's strong commitment to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Syria. We are convinced that there can be no military solution to the Syrian conflict and reaffirm our resolve to advance a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned UN-facilitated political process in line with Resolution 2254. Mr. Chairperson, Brazil condemns in the strongest terms the use of weapons of mass destruction, including chemical weapons, anywhere, by anyone, under any circumstances. These weapons are utterly incompatible with international humanitarian law and therefore must have no place in the practices and doctrines of today's world. In the past years, Brazil has considered with utmost attention the reports issued by the fact-finding missions, by the OPCW UN Joint Investigative Mechanism, and by the Investigation and Identification Team on incidents related to the use of chemical weapons in the Syrian Arab Republic. We reiterate our view that all investigations pertaining to those incidents must be impartial, balanced, technical, and comprehensive. The Chemical Weapons Convention constitutes the gold standard among all multilateral regimes on weapons of mass destruction. Not only does the CWC establish equal rights and obligations to all state parties, but it also creates a comprehensive and robust verification mechanism implemented by the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. In this sense, the continuous violations of the provisions of the CWC have a grave bearing on international peace and security. Mr. Chairperson, Brazil expresses its condolences to the aggrieved families of the victims of chemical weapons in Syria and recalls with utmost concern that these incidents are the first cases of confirmed deployment of weapons of mass destruction in the 21st century. We must not countenance such acts, and their perpetrators should be held accountable. While renewing its support to the OPCW Technical Secretariat, Brazil urges all states parties to fully implement their obligations under the CWC and to collaborate with the organization in the discharge of its mandate. Against this background, we regret the excessive politicization of the OPCW and the work of its technical secretariat, and encourage a collective effort to restore the culture of consensus within the organization and its decision-making bodies. Only through cooperation and dialogue will we be able to bolster the OPCW to accomplish its mission and prevent the re-emergence of the development, production, stockpiling, or use of chemicals as instruments of warfare. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Brazil, and now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the permanent mission of Russia and China for organizing this meeting, as well as the briefer for the briefing. As the main victim of the large-scale, most systematic and frequent use of chemical weapons in contemporary history, the Islamic Republic of Iran continues to condemn in the strongest possible terms the use of chemical weapons by anyone, anywhere, and under any circumstances. Likewise, as an active country in the negotiation of the Chemical Weapons Convention and a party thereto, Iran is a genuine strong advocate of promoting the balanced, full, effective, and non-discriminatory implementation of the convention, as well as upholding the integrity and authority of the OPCW. Historical cases have taught us that the authority of no instrument or institution can be upheld without strict adherence of all parties and participants to the rule of the game, and the CWC and OPCW are not exceptions. Partial implementation or discriminatory application of treaties, as well as the exploitation of international institutions or abuse of their process act like a poison pill for their authority and effective performance. This is more dangerous regarding conventions and organizations on non-proliferation and disarmament as they relate to the security of nations. The living example is the politicization and polarization of the OPCW following the consideration by that organization of the Syrian chemical weapons dossier initiated by a specific group of the CWC's states parties to further their politically motivated objectives. To that end, they first accused Syria of the use of chemical weapons, and then they first used the unprofessional and yet biased work of the fact-finding mission that was based mostly on unauthorized and open sources. Later, they followed their objective through the non-consensual decisions on the establishment of the so-called attribution mechanism, the investigation and identification team. While such a proposal had required the amendment of the convention, it was adopted by the affirmative vote of even less than half of the state parties, and also in the absence of the representative of 87 state parties. Now, to advance their goal, they are referring to a technically defective report of the IIT prepared without on-site investigation or due regard to the chain of custody. Such unproductive policies and destructive practices have divided the state parties, and by turning the organization into a battlefield of unfruitful disputes among the member states, have adversely affected the efforts for the full and effective realization of the convention purpose and objective. For instance, it now deflects the attention from the very purpose of the convention, namely the elimination of chemical weapons, which is yet to be realized due to blatant failure by the sole major possessor state party. All these events happened against the backdrop that in 2014, the head of the joint mission to eliminate chemical weapons in Syria, presenting her final report to the Security Council, confirmed that Syria has fulfilled all its commitments and that its entire chemical stockpile has been destroyed. Later, the OPCW confirmed the destruction of the entire chemical stockpile of Syria and all its 27 production facilities. Likewise, they also continue to ignore the Syrian government's significant cooperation with the OPCW and the United Nations, including providing over 18 monthly reports and large amount of information it provided to the OPCW. Such cooperation is still going on. Despite that, the Security Council has held over 18 monthly meetings on the subject without no result, as such meetings are only used to demonize Syria based on unsubstantiated allegations, to avoid further erosion of the OPCW's credibility and undermining of the CWC's authority and effectiveness. This trend needs to discontinue. We need to do whatever in our power to restore the OPCW's real positions and focus on promoting the CWC's full, effective, and non-discriminatory implementation. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank Ambassador Habib for his statement. Before I give the floor to the next speaker, I want to make one encouragement, a further one. I still would like to encourage our speakers to try to limit themselves to 3 minutes. We have still a list to go, but I wanted just to give an advance warning that approximately at 6 o'clock, even if we do not expire the list of speakers, I'm planning to give the floor back to the briefers for their comments. Still, we will have time to finish the list after they speak, if we don't finish before that. And now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Italy.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I will certainly try to follow your instructions. Mr. President, we appreciate the opportunity to offer our remarks on the state of implementation of Security Council Resolution 2118. Italy is deeply concerned about the re-emergence starting in 2013 of the use of chemical weapons in different geographical areas, particularly in conflict-ridden countries such as the Syrian Arab Republic. Italy's policy has always been centered on a firm rebuke of the use of chemical weapons anywhere, at any time, by anyone and under any circumstances. And we believe without exception that those responsible for the use of chemical weapons must be held accountable. Since the creation of the OPCW fact-finding mission mechanism in 2014, OPCW inspectors have attested to numerous cases of use of chemical weapons in Syria. More recently, the first report of the OPCW investigation and identification team to the OPCW Executive Council and to the UN Secretary General regrettably confirmed the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian Arab Air Force on 8 April 2020. This meets with Italy's strong condemnation, and conversely, with Italy's strong support for the Executive Council decision taken in July 2020 to address the possession and use of chemical weapons by the Syrian Arab Republic, and to urge the country to adopt all measures required by this decision. The use of chemical weapons must not be tolerated. The end of impunity is crucial for credible and effective deterrence, and we will continue to support all efforts towards ensuring accountability for those responsible of these heinous crimes. In this spirit, Italy has joined and actively supports the work of the International Partnership Against Impunity for the Use of Chemical Weapons. Italy also remains strongly committed to supporting the Chemical Weapons Convention and the work of the OPCW. We reiterate our full confidence in the technical expertise, objectivity, impartiality, and independence of the OPCW Technical Secretariat and its investigation and identification team. The international community as a whole must share the responsibility to enforce the prohibition of chemical weapons and uphold the global chemical non-proliferation regime, which is a basic building block for international peace and security. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Italy, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Canada. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm delivering this statement on behalf of the following countries: Australia, New Zealand, and my own country, Canada. Our countries remain deeply concerned by the use of chemical weapons in Syria, and we add our voices to what others have said today. There can be no political solution, and there can be no sustainable peace if there is impunity for crimes of war. Even more worrying is the morally indefensible position taken by some here today that the regime's abhorrent abuses can be ignored by attacking the very institutions that are meant to hold Syria to account. The OPCW investigation and identification team conclusion regarding the March 2017 sarin and chlorine attacks brings the regime's record of chemical weapons to 7 confirmed cases, and by direct implication establishes that the regime failed to declare and destroy all of its chemical weapons and chemical weapons production facilities. We welcome the OPCW Executive Council's decision of July 2020 to address Syria's possession and use of chemical weapons, and we strongly encourage the Conference of the States Parties to take action if Syria does not comply with the decision within the 90-day timeframe established by the Council. Colleagues, the irony of bringing this debate back towards the UN Security Council is not lost on us. It was Russia's refusal to allow the joint investigative mechanism to continue its work that led states parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention to put in place arrangements to identify perpetrators of chemical weapons attacks in Syria in full compliance with the convention. In doing so, states parties sent a very clear message that we would not allow any of the permanent members of the Council to shield the users of chemical weapons. At the same time, states parties demonstrated their confidence in the OPCW and its technical secretariat to undertake the difficult and dangerous work that has been assigned to it, not to reach political conclusions, but to identify the facts. The international community has shown that the collective stand against impunity is strong. We cannot allow this to be undermined by efforts to sow confusion and doubt about the OPCW's mandate and expertise. We are watching, I have to say, I'm certainly watching today, with growing concern, coordinated actions across several multilateral fora to discredit and undermine the OPCW. This meeting is simply the latest in a series of such efforts, which include misinformation campaigns, smear campaigns against staff, and efforts to starve the organization of vital financial resources. In its agenda for this meeting, Russia has asked what can be done to uphold the authority of the OPCW. Well, our answer is direct and quite simple. Stop undermining it. Canada, Australia, New Zealand reiterate our strongest support for the OPCW, whose impartial, independent, professional, and thorough investigative work is invaluable in bringing the perpetrators of chemical weapons used in Syria to the bar. We stand by the highly professional work of the OPCW's fact-finding mission and declarations assessment team. We stand by the legitimacy of the IIT and the credibility of its evidence-based and independent conclusions. To question the objectivity, impartiality, integrity, or capacity of the OPCW and its investigative bodies is, in fact, to prejudice against the use of chemical weapons. And if I may, Mr. Chairman, just briefly, on behalf of my own country, just make one additional comment. And that is, we do not think we should be attempting to draw attention away from the use and possession of chemical weapons, which is the question at hand today. It is the question that must be addressed and which must be answered. And we would also join with those colleagues who point out that we still don't know what happened to Mr. Navalny, except that he was poisoned by chemicals. And we still call for an independent investigation into that horrific event. Thank you.
I think the distinguished permanent representative of Canada who spoke on behalf of the CANS group, I can't help thanking him for the recipe he provided to us. We'll take that into account, although we have a differing, diverging view on this thing. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nicaragua.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Nicaragua would like to thank Russia for organizing this meeting. My country, as a chemical weapons free state party, is committed to the full, effective, and non-discriminatory implementation of this convention. We also condemn their use wherever they come from and against whoever. We oppose the politicization of the Convention on the prohibition of the development, production, stockpiling, and use of chemical weapons and their destructions. We are concerned that this politicization trend has been intensifying, endangering the institutionality and credibility of the OPCW, as evidenced by the selective approach and discriminatory way of the allegation of the use of chemical weapons in Syria. And we recognize at this, in this meeting the enormous political will demonstrated by Syria in joining this convention and complying with these regulations under extremely complex conditions. The case that has been exemplified today shows us that the danger of unilateralism acting outside the UN Security Council in clear violation of international law and the UN Charter. We cannot be dragged down by the biased interests of certain countries. We need to preserve the professionalism of this and any convention. We have repeatedly called for the need to preserve the technical mandate of this organization and that any investigation should be conducted based on objectivity, impartiality, and transparency. I thank you, Your Excellency.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nicaragua. Now I would like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nigeria. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Permit me to express the gratitude of my delegation to you for organizing this Arria formula meeting, and also to the briefers for the detailed brief on this important subject matter that borders on our collective security and world peace. Nigeria condemns and views the use of chemical weapons in Syria and any part of the world as a violation of international law and a threat to international peace and security. Therefore, the use of such weapons in armed conflict is against the tenets of the Convention on the Prohibition of the Development, Production, Stockpiling, and Use of Chemical Weapons and on their destruction. Nigeria has a principled position on the total elimination of chemical weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, except for those meant for peaceful purposes. This has informed its commitment to all such enabling conventions and treaties in this regard. The use of chemical weapons is considerably prohibited by international, humanitarian, criminal, and customary laws, as attested to by an overwhelming membership of the United Nations as parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention, with an express determination to abide by its provisions. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons therefore bears the responsibility of ensuring the activities of our organization, including the work of a fact-finding mission, the identification and investigative team, and the declaration assessment team are impartial and transparent and not politicized. The OPCW fact-finding mission has repeatedly confirmed the use of chemical weapons in Syria. This is a serious concern to my delegation as the effect of chemical weapons do not discriminate between combatants and civilians, with highly devastating long-term effects on their victims. Therefore, identifying those responsible for chemical weapons attacks is a precondition for holding its perpetrators to account with the appropriate sanctions to demonstrate that the violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention and the non-use norm does not go unpunished. Mr. President, the successful implementation of Security Council Resolution 2118 requires the full cooperation of the Syrian Arab Republic and the OPCW. While the report of the International Investigative Team on the alleged use of chemical weapons by the Syrian government remains a contention between the UN security members and other member states, the Syrian government, in keeping with its international obligations, could allow the OPCW teams under improved guidelines unfiltered access to further conduct their work on a comprehensive scale for a possible consensus conclusion. Also, since a consensus by the Security Council on the Syrian report would arguably be hinged on a fair, transparent, and unbiased investigative process, it is therefore important to ensure adherence to these processes for a credible and acceptable report by not just the Security Council membership, but the generality of the UN membership as stakeholders of a world free of weapons of mass destruction and who have been seized with the subject matter over time. The Security Council must therefore be unified in its position for the peaceful conclusion of the process to allow for the successful implementation of Resolution 2118. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nigeria, and now I'd like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 2013, Syria acceded to the Chemical Weapons Convention. Nevertheless, contrary to its obligations as a new member state and contrary to its obligations under Security Council Resolution 2118, it chose not to surrender all of its stockpiles of chemical weapons for destruction, nor to give up all its production facilities. Even today, 7 years later, Syria has not fully disclosed its chemical weapons program and does not fully cooperate with the Declaration Assessment Team of OPCW. On the contrary, Syria has repeatedly used chemical weapons in attacks on its own people. Recently, the first report of the Investigation and Identification Team concluded that there are reasonable grounds to believe that in 3 separate chemical weapon attacks in Latamena in March 2017, units from the Syrian Arab Air Force were responsible for using sarin and chlorine. Previous UN-mandated reports by the Joint Investigative Mechanism found Syria to have used chemical weapons against his own people on at least 4 different occasions. This leads to the conclusion that the Syrian Arab Republic is in breach of its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention and has failed to comply with Security Council Resolution 2118. Mr. Chairman, in June 2018, member states of the OPCW mandated the Director General to establish the Investigation and Identification Team to investigate possible attacks with chemical weapons in Syria and identify those responsible. It is of the utmost importance that member states support the work of the OPCW and enable the IIT to conduct the investigations in full autonomy. The Netherlands has full confidence in the professionalism, impartiality, and objectivity of the OPCW as a whole, including the fact-finding mission and the IIT. The Netherlands stands by the decision of the Executive Council of July 2020, condemning Syria for the use of chemical weapons and requesting that Syria within 90 days redress the situation as demanded in the decision. Mr. Chairman, to conclude, the use of chemical weapons can never be justified. those responsible must be held to account, and the need for accountability is not limited to the use of chemical weapons. That is why my country has invoked Syria's responsibility for human rights violations under international law, specifically holding Syria to account for torture under the UN Convention Against Torture. We also wish to express our continued support for the IIIM. For the victims, for Syria, and for the international community, it is critical that all of these violations cease and that impunity finally ends. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of the Netherlands, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belarus.
Thank you very much, Vasily. Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I would like to thank the Russian Federation and China for convening this meeting. And it is indeed a very good opportunity for all of us, for all member states, for a wider audience also to have a look at the situation on where the OPCW stands right now, and to do it in an impartial and comprehensive way. And this is exactly what the Security Council, unfortunately, is really lacking now. Unbiased and competent opinions proved by facts and evidence from the ground. The Republic of Belarus has always respected the authority of the OPCW as the primary international organization to lead multilateral and, which is very important, concerted efforts aimed at the prevention of chemical weapons. Unfortunately, we have seen for quite some time already, for quite a long time actually already, that this intergovernmental institution is being abused by certain countries with one very simple objective, which is to satisfy their narrow political ambitions. As it was stressed in a joint statement by a group of the OPCW member states, including the Republic of Belarus, issued in The Hague earlier this year, the situation after the release of the first report by the IIT on the alleged incidents in Altamena, Syria, is of high concern and also of high regret. We reiterate that the conclusions made by the IIT are arguable, as the demands of a number of states to clarify certain critical issues have simply been ignored. The facts presented today by a number of previous speakers also prove that the findings of the mechanism are groundless. Moreover, we believe that the establishment of the IIT, as well as the way it conducts its work, is inconsistent with the provisions of the Convention on the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. It is obvious to us that the IIT interferes into the exclusive authority of the United Nations Security Council. We are concerned that such unconstructive approach can cause further split in the organization and will only contribute to unnecessary politicization of its activities, which is unacceptable. Once again, we stand in favor of normalization of the work of the organization and call on the resumption of a mutually respectful dialogue among member states under strict compliance with the Convention for the benefit of all parties. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of Belarus, and now I'd like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much to the host for convening this meeting, and also thank you to the panelists for their briefing. We reiterate our commitment to the Convention on the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and its full, effective, and non-discriminatory implementation. We strongly reject the use of chemical weapons by any actor and under any circumstances. Cuba does not possess, nor does it intend to possess chemical weapons, and insists on the need to guarantee the destruction of the stockpiles declared by the United States, the only possessor state parties, in accordance with the provision of the Convention, its verification annex, and the relevant decision adopted by member states. We reject selective, non-transparent, and politically motivated approaches on the implementation of the Convention and emphasize the need to avoid the politicization of the work of the OPCW and the allegation of the use of chemical weapons in Syria. it must be preserved the technical mandate of the OPCW. We recognize the unprecedented efforts by which the Syrian Arab Republic acceded to the convention, as well as the cooperation offered by its government to the technical secretariat of the OPCW in the difficult conditions faced by this country since its accession. Research on the alleged use of chemical weapons in Syria must be conducted based in objectivity, impartiality, and transparency. We oppose to any unilateral action outside the United Nations Security Council in clear violation of international law and the United Nations Charter. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cuba. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Mr. Chair, thank you for organizing this meeting and providing a platform to this. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm starting from the beginning. Mr. Chair, thank you for organizing this meeting and providing a platform to discuss this issue of utmost significance. At the outset, I would like to underline that Turkey condemns in the strongest term the use of chemical weapons by anyone, anywhere, and under any circumstances. This is a serious violation of international law and a crime against humanity. The case of Syria remains highly worrisome. It has become clear during 10 years of Syrian conflict that there is no guarantee to prevent the recurrence of chemical weapons attacks due to the regime's complete disregard of human lives, let alone its obligations emanating from the Chemical Weapons Convention. Indeed, the regime's repeated crimes have been well documented on several occasions since 2013. The adoption of the Security Council Resolution 2118 was an important step in the aftermath of the gruesome attack in Ghouta in August 2013, which left hundreds of innocents dead and many more injured. Unfortunately, 7 years after its adoption, the objectives of this resolution are yet to be fulfilled. This is mainly due to the ongoing gaps, inconsistencies, and discrepancies resulting from the initial chemical weapons declaration of the Assad regime. We continue to expect full implementation of the Security Council Resolution 2118. While the regime has evaded its responsibility stemming from this resolution, the record for the use of chemical weapons has been constantly growing. There is a clear correlation between its non-compliance and growing sense of we cannot let the regime perpetuate the illusion that it has no chemical weapons stockpiles. The regime must be urged for a swift and result-oriented cooperation with the OPCW. A strong message by the members of the Security Council is critical in this regard. Mr. Chair, we are all entitled to our own opinions, but not to our own facts. OPCW Technical Secretariat, the fact-finding mission, and the investigation and identification team perform a critical role in a scientific manner by identifying the perpetrators of the chemical weapons attacks in Syria. The Latamina report of the IIT clearly established the responsibility of the Syrian regime Air Force in 3 chemical weapons attacks that took place in March 2017. This report is an important step to ensure that those responsible for the chemical weapons attacks in Syria are held accountable for their crimes. Likewise, we look forward to the conclusion of the ongoing investigations carried out by both the FFM and the IIT on other cases. Turkey reiterates its strong support for the declaration assessment team. We have full trust in the professionalism and impartiality of the FFM and the objectivity of its reports. We sincerely believe that it would serve no party's interest to question the credibility of the FFM. Turkey is among the co-sponsors of the decision adopted during the 94th Executive Council of the OPCW. This decision is a crucial step in addressing the possession and the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime. This decision sets clear deadlines for the regime in order to return to full compliance with the Chemical Weapons Convention. I would like to also recall the responsibility of the parties who have influence on the Syrian regime in this regard. Turkey will continue to support the steps taken by the international community, first and foremost by UN and the OPCW, for ensuring full accountability in Syria. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Turkey. I have 4 more speakers on my list. I hope that if they stick to the self-imposed limitation of 3 minutes will be fine on time. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Venezuela.
Thank you so much to the Russian Federation for organizing this meeting. Venezuela, as a state party of the OPCW, has carried out in full its obligation under the convention. Our country does not possess, produce, or stockpile chemical weapons and categorically condemns in the strongest terms the use of chemical weapons and toxic chemicals as weapons anywhere by anyone and under any circumstances. We firmly believe that the perpetrators behind these criminal atrocities must be held accountable under the law for their actions. Venezuela also supports the work of the OPCW and believes that it is an organization that is exclusively technical in nature and finds it to be fundamental to preserve the nature in which it was conceived. As we have expressed on many occasions, Venezuela considers that the decision title addressing the threat from chemical weapons use adopted by the fourth special session of the Conference of the State Parties to the CWC and the establishment of the IIT exceeds the limits of the field of disarmament and could lead to a dangerous situation in which the mandate of an international organization is broadly interpreted with prejudice to the exclusive prerogative of the United Nations Security Council. Venezuela also regrets from the beginning the way this decision was taken, by a vote, not consensus, setting a dangerous precedent for the way in which the OPCW operates. There was not necessary to introduce amendment to the convention and respect the corresponding procedures. Otherwise, this was made de facto, undermining and eroding the authority and integrity of the CWC. For this reason, we have voted against this decision in 2018. The OPCW is going through a terrible crisis of credibility. First, due to the questionable conclusions of the FFM, and now by the IAT, it seems that both mechanisms have been weaponized by some powers to violate the sovereignty of Syria in pursuance of an illegal policy of regime change. After the release of the reports, the scientific shortcomings and extremely selective information have increased the complaints about the true intention of this research group and has enlarged the demands of a significant number of states that have sought for clarification. We all need an OPCW full of legitimacy and integrity to enforce the CWC. For this reason, we need to abandon the path of politicization to which some member states want to drive us. Because if we don't, we are complicit in the destruction of this organization, thus endangering international peace and security. We demand the restoration of the strictly compliance of the Chemical Weapons Convention and respect of the international law as a whole, in order to restore the credibility of the OPCW and improve the fulfillment of its mission. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of Venezuela, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland.
Thank you, Vasily. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the Russian Federation and China for the meeting. I want to take this opportunity to reiterate Ireland's full support for the work of the organisation for the prohibition of chemical weapons and its important body of work so far in investigating incidents of chemical weapons use in Syria. Ireland wholeheartedly condemns the use of chemical weapons. We supported the efforts in recent years to strengthen the convention, including through the establishment of the Investigation and Identification Team. The work of the OPCW in investigating and attributing responsibility for the use of chemical weapons is an important first step towards accountability and an end to impunity. While this body, the Security Council itself, has all too often been paralysed in its response to the appalling incidents of chemical weapons use in Syria, the OPCW has diligently fulfilled its mandate and has reported in detail on incidents of chemical weapons use. So therefore, we see it as regrettable that the platform afforded by today's meeting is used to seek to undermine the professionalism and impartiality of the OPCW. In our view, there can be no doubt that Syria is duty-bound to eliminate in its entirety its chemical weapons program, to cooperate with the technical secretariat of the OPCW, to allow access and to stop immediately all use of chemical weapons. At the EU level, Ireland supports the chemical weapons sanctions regime, whose current listings include individuals and entities linked to the development and use of chemical weapons in Syria. And we're also a member of the International Partnership Against Impunity for the Use of Chemical Weapons. Mr. President, the marked increase in the use of chemical weapons in recent years shows that the prohibition and the global non-use norm of these appalling weapons is under threat. The international community collectively must redouble efforts to prevent impunity, and the work of the OPCW in investigating and attributing responsibility for the use of chemical weapons is an important strand in that international accountability framework. Ireland supports all that work. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent representative for Ireland. Thank you, Geraldine. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Poland.
Sorry. Thank you, Vasily. Let me thank the co-sponsors of organizing this meeting, because such kind of discussion just only manifests that we should spare no effort to eliminate any kind of use of chemical weapons, and this use presents a threat to the international peace and security, and it's a crime under the international law. And yet, just a couple of weeks ago, Novichok, and it's not a coincidence that this is the Russian word, was used to poison Alexei Navalny. And this was also the case in London regarding Mr. Skripal. So we do hope that the Russian Federation will demonstrate its commitment to the full implementation of CWC by allowing the independent and transparent investigation into the case of Mr. Navalny, and also by stopping the smear campaign against OPCW. Having said that, and also bearing that I have 3 minutes, let me reiterate again our full Poland support for OPCW and its Director General. We have full confidence in professionalism, objectivity, and impartiality and independence of IIT. And we call on Syria to cooperate in good faith and to comply with the decision of the Executive Council of OPCW, reached in July 2020. Thank you very much. I hope that I've been talking less than 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariusz. I appreciate your time diligence. I would like now to give the floor to the last speaker on my list, after which I will request our briefers to intervene again. And this is the distinguished representative of Luxembourg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Much has been said already, so I will be brief. Implementation of Security Council Resolution 2118 is a matter of utmost importance to all. Luxembourg was an elected member of the Security Council when the resolution was adopted unanimously 7 years ago. Luxembourg would like to see this opportunity to reiterate its full confidence in its technical expertise, objectivity, impartiality, professionalism, and independence of the OPCW's Director General and Technical Secretariat, as well as its investigation and identification team. A limited number of states have previously as a fact-finding mission and the work of the IIT since the very first reports on the use of chemical weapons in Syria. It is important to remember that the IIT, under the supervision of the OPCW, has set up because the extension of the mandate of the OPCW UN Joint Investigative Mechanism was blocked and veto in the Security Council on 24 October 2017. This happened after the regime concluded that the Syrian Arab Republic forces were responsible for using chemical weapons. So OPCW has to be for the way in which it has addressed allegations regarding the methodology of investigation teams and the impartiality of the reports. The OPCW carried out a transparent and thorough investigation following those allegations. The results were made public on 6 February 2020, and they speak to the professionalism of the organization. The report of the IIT clearly shows that investigations were conducted with the utmost care, expertise, impartiality, and transparency. We would object to those criticizing the IIT for not investigating on the ground in Syria. Indeed, in spite of many good faith attempts, the Syrian authorities have blocked all these requests of investigators. Despite numerous obstacles it has been facing, the OPCW Technical Secretariat has continued to ensure the exemplary quality of its work. More broadly, we sincerely hope that the international norm prohibiting the use of chemical weapons by anyone under any circumstances will be re-established, which will ultimately make the need to use fact-finding missions and international investigations a requirement of the past. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Luxembourg. Now, as we expired our list of speakers, I'd like to return back to briefers and request them to comment what they have heard. We have approximately time till 6:30. I also wrap it up when the briefers speak. And first, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Ian Henderson. Mr. Henderson, you have the floor.
I'd just like to confirm my sound is working. Yes. Right. This was quite an eye-opener to me. Far from be it my role to castigate the distinguished excellencies, delegates, colleagues, but I'd have to say I'm bitterly disappointed. Having been around for long enough, I did not necessarily expect anything different. There was no discussion. It was a series of political statements and from both sides, from my point of view, propaganda. But this is the world that we live in. This is the world that I was posed with in my time with the OPCW. My role here now is to defend the OPCW and the Technical Secretariat. I'd like to make that very clear. Disinformation campaigns, discrediting the OPCW, this has got, from my point of view, nothing to do with that. I noticed that there is still, and since day one on the Duma investigation, there has been no willingness or desire whatsoever to even contemplate the fact that there could be some science, facts, and engineering that demonstrate an outcome contrary to the FFM report. To this day, no one, not one person, other than attempts from some anarchistic journalists, no one formally has approached me and said, can you tell me your experience, what happened? With the exception of one. After the Duma FFM report was released, there was something of a crisis in the Technical Secretariat. This is prior to the unkind leaking of my engineering report. So prior to that, we were deciding what to do. I made it clear that the findings of the FFM report were not supported by science or engineering. And I can make that clear to anyone who is interested in that. I was then invited by a delegation from one of the Western states parties, and I provided a full briefing. At the end of that briefing, the gentleman said, "This is really serious. This is very big. It will certainly go higher. This will go very high." And then he said, by way of apology, he said, "But of course you realize we won't be able to do anything about this." That's the situation I faced and I continue to face to this day. Out of all of the statements made today, I believe I'm the only one who has spent a lot of time in Syria, including in Damascus and in Douma and other locations. I have had an involvement in all three of the Syria operational missions, the DAT, the SSRC, and the Douma FFM. Now, I don't want to be naive or overly cynical, but I noticed that many of the political statements were cut and paste. And that's the way things work. That's to be expected. But I do sympathize in a way. That's your job. And I can understand the panic caused by the possibility that there is clear science, engineering, facts and information that call into question the Douma FFM investigation. Why? Because that's the only one, the first and the only investigation where we, the OPCW inspectors, actually got to the site of the alleged incident, and we did our work. And I thank you for some of your commendations for the impartiality, the professionalism, and the difficult work, often in dangerous circumstances. We did experience that in many missions, including Douma, but we are apparently not included under that because the Douma FFM report was written by one person who'd only been to Turkey and another who had not deployed anywhere. I'll now respond to a question implicitly raised by the gentleman from Indonesia. And let's look at, try and get some positivity. What could be done to fix the situation? What did I experience that was clearly, in my view, a problem? It's not with the OPCW, it's not with the Technical Secretariat. It's a fantastic organization, and there are hundreds of impartial, committed staff members who've made it the success that it is. However, in the Syria mission, it has very clearly evolved into something different from what it should be. First of all, the Syria missions are run by a handful of staff who report to the Office of the Director General through the Chief of Cabinet, who reports, I'd have to say, in my experience through observation, to some of the key Western delegations, and obviously the US permanent representative plays a leading role in that. The first thing to fix is that the Syria missions need to be subjected to the same professional peer review as the rest of the work of the Technical Secretariat. This single line of control through a Chief of Cabinet, the former being British and the current French, reporting directly to influential delegations cannot be allowed to persist. So that's the first thing to fix it. The second thing is the the reliance of the FFM and the JIM and the IIT on carefully selected external experts who remain anonymous and whose work is selectively cherry-picked by the FFM, IIT, or JIM to serve the generation of a result that is generally, if not always, been the expression of an opinion from those individuals as to what they thought was the most likely outcome. Hence the use of the words, it's reasonable to believe that this is the most likely situation. And hence the problem with Duma, where for the first time there is a clear volume of scientific, engineering, and procedural facts and information that will be used, can be used to prove otherwise. Which leads to the third thing to fix, is that these investigations in Syria need to have set a more realistic minimum standard of evidence. And I put evidence in inverted commas. This is information, data, materials, open source or whatever. And these minimum standards need to be supported by science, and it's transparent science, not the selective excerpts from opinions provided by carefully selected anonymous experts. I think I've probably said more than I should already. And my request remains out there. Don't believe me, but just take it seriously enough to believe, as was the case in Iraq in 2002. I had a light-hearted bet on Iraq. My view was, no, sanity will prevail. We in the WMD intelligence information area, we know what the case is, and it must prevail. It must get through at some stage. I lost the bet because it didn't. And I hate to say I see the same sort of thing happening now. But again, as I said, the lockdown has become impenetrable, and it probably will remain that way. So one or two final remarks. When I reviewed the DAT dossier during the preparation for the first inspections of the SSRC, having been around for much longer than many other people, having been in the starting group of team leaders in the Secretariat in 1997, we were faced with all of the initial declarations from the possessor states. The level of inconsistencies, discrepancies in their declarations, I found to be roughly the same as the questions I saw having been raised in by the DAT on the Syrian declarations. There were mistakes. There were things that should have been declared and were only declared under pressure, such as the Ricin program. And there were some aspects about the pinacolyl alcohol and SOMAN detected in the SSRC. But none of these reached the level that would have, in the early days, had triggered this this years of questioning and to and fro on these so-called inconsistencies, omissions in the declaration. I will share with you some of the wording that was used by various people in the Secretariat in reference to the DATS dossier. The wording was, keep the file open. That was the primary thing. Keep the file open, keep the pressure on. Now, I'm not going to pretend I have the political nous to interpret exactly what that meant, who it was raised by, but in the absence of any progress I see being made, I think I'll leave that thought with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson. I just wanted to tell you that in 15 minutes, exactly at 6:30, will be cut off of the Zoom translation. That's why I think I will fall victim to my final remarks. If they don't happen, I think that it's more important to give the floor to the briefers. But I want them to understand that we have 15 minutes to go. And now I give the floor to Mr. Mate.
I'll be very brief. There was a lot of comments today from certain member states that there is an effort here to denigrate the OPCW. I just want to echo Ian Henderson in saying that I'm not here to denigrate the OPCW. I'm here to defend the OPCW from exploitation. And it is telling that you have two veteran celebrated inspectors from the OPCW, one of whom is here today, Ian Henderson, coming to you with serious concerns, proposing a very simple proposal, which is that given the controversy, given the conflicting claims and facts, that these inspectors be granted the opportunity to meet with the Director General and other OPCW officials, along with the rest of the Duma team who actually went to Syria to prevent their findings. And anybody who fails to support that proposal, I have to wonder about why. There was talk from the British ambassador, Ambassador Allen. He made reference to my Twitter account and said, for some reason, as if my Twitter account has some bearing on the reliability of my reporting. I'm flattered, Mr. Allen, that you pay attention to my Twitter account. I'm not sure what it has to do with whether or not the OPCW was compromised, but regardless, I would encourage you to, at minimum, pay as much attention to my Twitter feed as to the actual OPCW scientists who went to Syria, wrote a report, and had their report censored, and now want to present their findings to the OPCW in a transparent manner. I want to close finally by quoting the inspectors because they have proposed a very simple path, which is simply to have their concerns aired. Ian Henderson, who we've heard from, he wrote to the Director General Arria in a letter earlier this year, our sole duty is to be true to the facts and the science. And once that has been achieved, we will gladly accept the proven and agreed scientific outcomes. Inspector B, who again wrote the initial report, was at the time the OPCW's top expert in chemical weapons inspections. He wrote to the Director General, quote, you need only look at our impeccable records and support to the Technical Secretariat over a combined tenure of almost 30 years. That we would suddenly go rogue at the autumn of our careers with nothing to gain and everything to lose defies all logic. Why would we risk so much to push a personal view? Hardly. Something has gone wrong inside the OPCW, sir, and we wanted you to know. It's that simple. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Mate, and I now give the floor to Mr. Postol. You are off air. Just wait a second. We'll switch you on. You have to switch on air.
You got me now?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. I am a scientist by training, but I have worked as an analyst for the Congress. I worked as a scientific and policy advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations, who commands more ships, more planes, and more people under arms than the combined forces of the UK, France, and Germany. Okay, so I have some experience here. And I went to MIT after a career that was out of academia on an academic record that got me tenured at a full professor level when I was hired. And I also have had the privilege of working during my career with several senior distinguished diplomats. So I'm not I know some of the world of diplomacy. I've worked with the U.S. ambassador to China. I've worked with a British permanent representative to the UN and a British high commissioner to India, 2 ambassadors to NATO, and the ambassador who negotiated the confidence and security measures building agreement in Europe, which our British, French, and German friends did benefit from. I have not in my experience seen such a disservice to international law as I have witnessed here today. The UN is an important international vehicle for enforcing international law. And if you people are not interested in facts, then there can be no justice. Fooling around with these statements, which I'm very familiar with because I've seen them over many years, and not knowing your basic facts is just, I must say, I'm not trying to hide my outrage. Let me give you just an example of the outrage I just heard repeated by the French, the British. You said that the munitions in Houta were used against the people in Zamalka by the Syrian government. Well, that may be true, I don't know. But let me tell you a fact that your own UN inspector, Aka Selstrom, agreed with me. He was the chief investigator in the Damascus case. We agreed that the munition could only have a range of 2 kilometers, which put it absolutely inside the rebel-controlled areas where this attack occurred. Now, maybe you guys can explain it to me. I'm just a scientist from MIT, but you ought to get your facts right before you just come out with these absolute statements. And I must say, I really am outraged. I feel naive. I came here to give you a talk that was purely technical, and it could be disproved by technical means if you had the technical means to do it, but you don't. Instead, I've been called malicious, propagandist, chutzpah by the German, who I find it particularly annoying, and participating in a charade. Well, let me say to these 3 distinguished diplomats, anytime you would like to have a discussion, anytime, bring all your technical people and let them try to tear me apart on what I presented to you. And if I sound angry, I am, because I believe in the UN and I believe in the OPCW. And frankly, the way you guys have behaved today, I don't think you believe in those organizations. I'll stop here.
I thank Professor Postol. Look, we have little time left.
Yes, I'm sorry.
I'm not doing any wrap up or any kind of assessment of what happened today. I just wanted to say 2 things. That the discussion showed clearly 2 things. First, that it continues to generate immense interest among member states. The turnout speaks for itself. Secondly, that we are in profound divergence on how we treat those episodes. Our aim was, we were not naive. We knew that we wouldn't be able to convince anybody here. The one that does want to hear, he wouldn't listen. And that discussion also demonstrated it. I sympathize with Professor Postol that he was caught in the outrage from the statements that he didn't expect. But believe me, Professor, that we find ourselves quite often in this council, but we have to hide our rage as much as we can. The aim of the discussion was to bring facts to to the table, and not to neglect them, not to shy away from them, not to sideline them. But given that the political Syrian dossier is extremely politicized, of course, we couldn't expect that we will succeed completely. But we think that we will continue this exercise. We promised it at the last meeting on the Syrian chemical file, and we will continue to educate both the Security Council members and the general public of what really is happening in Syria. We are also for against impunity and for attributability of those crimes to those who committed them. The question, who committed them? And that's a big difference between us and those who advocate the other thing. I'm being told that my Chinese colleague requested for the floor. He is a co-host. I cannot deny him the floor, given especially that we have a few minutes left. Distinguished Representative Chen, you have the floor.
Thank you, Vasily. I'll be very brief. I just want to take the opportunity to thank our three briefers for your detailed information, professional analysis, and a valuable contribution to the meeting. I think the insight and the insight you provided and shared with us is quite revealing and shocking. I hope those information could be shared with the OPCW. And in the future, Security Council deliberation on the Syrian chemical dossier, those information should be taken into account. And just now, Christoph, the German ambassador, and some of our Western colleagues, they questioned the purpose of China and Russia for organizing this Arria formula meeting. I think the purpose is quite clear. They should read the concept note by themselves. Just now, they did not comment. They did not comment on the facts and the evidence provided by the briefers. They simply ignore it, reject it, and discredit our briefers. I don't think that's the right attitude. I think they can. I'm not expert. I have not jumped to conclusions simply after hearing the three briefings. But I think at least I'm open to different views and opinions. I think our Western colleagues, if they want to challenge the three briefers, they should challenge them with the facts, with the science, with the logic, but not with the bias, with the political position and the hidden agenda. I encourage our Western colleagues to show their sincerity. And I think today's meeting is just a magnification of the political maneuvering they're exercising on this chemical dossier. Finally, Vasily, let me repeat that this issue is of great concern for the international community. It must be addressed with a scientific, objective, and a responsible approach. Finally, thank the three briefers again. Thank you, Vasily.
Thank you very much, gang, and thank you for co-hosting this meeting. I think that we came to an end of it. I sincerely thank all the participants, and in particular, of course, the three briefers for their insight, for their courage, and for their approach. And I think that nobody can challenge that the approach that they demonstrated was objective. And I think we should continue this dialogue we should continue this dialogue in order to find the truth, which is sometimes hidden behind many layers of insinuations that we witnessed through all these years of the Syrian chemical file. I thank you for participating and goodbye.